A wealthy family's world was turned upside down when their son fell in love with their black nanny. When she announced her pregnancy, the family demanded a DNA test, expecting to prove she was lying. Instead, they discovered an impossible truth. She was actually the millionaire's long-lost daughter from his college years, making the son and his love interest half-siblings. Now the family must deal with the consequences of their prejudices and a past that refused to stay buried. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The Montgomery mansion hummed with a quiet opulence. Sunlight, filtered through stained glass windows, cast kaleidoscopic patterns on the polished mahogany floors. Ethan Montgomery, heir to the Montgomery fortune, sat by the grand fireplace, a half-finished book abandoned in his lap. His gaze drifted to Anya, their nanny, humming softly as she soothed little Lily, the youngest Montgomery child, to sleep in the adjacent sunroom. Anya's gentle touch, the quiet grace of her movements, captivated him. He loved the way the sunlight caught the rich brown of her skin, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheek. The scent of lavender from her soap lingered in the air, a comforting presence in the often cold atmosphere of the house. Eleanor Montgomery, Ethan's mother, entered the room. Her perfectly coiffed hair and impeccable attire a stark contrast to the warmth radiating from Anya. A barely perceptible frown creased her forehead as she observed the scene. The subtle tension, the unspoken disapproval hanging between her and Anya, felt heavier than the antique furniture surrounding them. Ethan felt a familiar pang of guilt, a silent battle raging between his love for Anya and the protective instincts ingrained in him since birth. Later that evening, during a family dinner devoid of genuine warmth, Anya announced her pregnancy. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the clinking of silverware against china, a discordant symphony of unease. Richard Montgomery, Ethan's father, cleared his throat, his eyes betraying a flicker of apprehension beneath his composed exterior. "A DNA test," he stated flatly, the words hanging heavy in the air, laced with unspoken accusations. The casual cruelty stung Anya, but her quiet dignity remained unshaken. She met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of fear and quiet resolve. The weight of their prejudiced assumptions pressed down on her, a palpable burden in the opulent yet emotionally barren dining room. The exquisite meal suddenly tasted like ash in her mouth. The days that followed were a blur of anxious waiting. The Montgomery mansion, usually a vibrant display of wealth, felt suffocating. Anya retreated to her small room, the floral wallpaper a stark contrast to the turmoil within her. The scent of lavender, once comforting, now clung to her like a shroud. Ethan, torn between his love for Anya and his family's icy disapproval, paced the library, the leather-bound books mocking his helplessness. He could hear Eleanor's clipped tones echoing from the drawing room, her words, though muffled, sharp enough to pierce his heart. One evening, he found Anya by the window overlooking the manicured gardens. The setting sun painted the sky in hues of orange and purple, a beautiful backdrop to their silent anguish. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative, unsure. They don't understand," Anya whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. The faint scent of her perfume, a delicate blend of rose and jasmine, filled his senses, a poignant reminder of their stolen moments. Ethan pulled her close, burying his face in her hair. "I know," he murmured, the words a fragile shield against the storm brewing within their family. "But it's going to be all right. We'll face it together." His voice cracked, betraying the vulnerability he desperately tried to conceal. The silence between them was heavy, laden with unspoken fears and shared anxieties. The ticking grandfather clock in the hall seemed to amplify the tension, each tick a hammer blow against their fragile hope. The weight of expectation, the prejudiced judgment of his family, felt like a physical force pressing down on them. He held her tighter, the warmth of her body a small comfort in a world suddenly filled with cold, harsh realities. Their love, once a bright flame, now flickered precariously, threatened by the storm of their family's disapproval and the looming uncertainty of the DNA test results. The garden, once a symbol of their stolen moments, now seemed to reflect the growing chasm between them and the Montgomery family. The antiseptic smell of the clinic was a stark contrast to the lavender-scented haven of Anya's room. Richard sat stiffly, his expensive suit feeling like a suffocating cage. Eleanor's hand, icy and tight in his, offered little comfort. The doctor, a young woman with kind eyes, cleared her throat, the sound echoing in the suffocating silence. She placed a file on the polished mahogany desk, the crisp paper a jarring sound against the hushed atmosphere. "The results are unexpected," she began, her voice carefully neutral. Richard's breath hitched. He glanced at Eleanor, her face a mask of strained composure, her knuckles white against her tightly clasped hands. The doctor continued, her words measured, each syllable heavy with import. "The DNA test confirms a biological relationship between Mr. Montgomery and Ms. Anya Sharma. The degree of kinship is that of father and daughter." A stunned silence descended, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning. The room spun for Richard. 20 years. 20 years of a life half-lived. A secret buried deep beneath layers of wealth and denial. Shame, raw and visceral, washed over him. He looked at Eleanor, her eyes wide with disbelief, a mixture of shock and simmering anger visible in their depths. The carefully constructed facade of their perfect life crumbled, revealing a gaping chasm of deceit and buried truth. Eleanor's breath hitched. This can't be right," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic thumping of her heart. Ethan burst into the room, his face etched with worry. He stopped dead, his eyes widening as he took in the scene. His father's ashen face, his mother's frozen expression, the doctor's solemn gaze. Anya, entering behind him, her eyes filled with a mixture of hope and apprehension, stopped equally short. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, a palpable tension that crackled between them, a silent scream echoing the turmoil within each heart. The sterile scent of the clinic seemed to morph into something acrid, something bitter and suffocating. The polished mahogany desk felt like a cold slab of unforgiving judgment. The silence stretched, a suffocating, unbearable void, before it finally fractured, shattering the fragile peace, splintering the carefully constructed illusion of their privileged existence. The future, once a clear and bright path, now lay in ruins, a vast and uncertain landscape littered with the debris of shattered expectations and a truth too painful to bear. The silence in the Montgomery mansion was thick, a suffocating blanket woven from disbelief and simmering resentment. Sunlight, usually a cheerful guest, felt intrusive, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the oppressive stillness. Eleanor paced the grand hallway, the click-clack of her heels a relentless counterpoint to the unspoken accusations hanging in the air. Richard sat rigidly in his study, the leather of his armchair cold against his skin, a stark contrast to the burning shame that consumed him. He stared at a framed photo of Anya as a child, a picture he'd never seen before, a picture that felt both intimately familiar and utterly alien. Ethan, meanwhile, wandered the manicured gardens, the meticulously pruned roses a mockery of the chaos within him. He clutched a half-smoked cigarette, the bitter taste a reflection of his own turmoil. He loved Anya, a love that felt both incandescent and impossibly fragile in the face of his family's rejection. The weight of his father's betrayal, of his mother's cold disapproval, pressed down on him, suffocating. He thought of Anya, her quiet strength, the unwavering love in her eyes. The thought of the baby, their baby, added another layer of agonizing complexity to his already shattered world. He had to talk to her, to reassure her, to somehow navigate this impossible situation. Later, under the oppressive weight of the day's revelations, Anya sat alone in her room. The familiar lavender sent a meager comfort against the emotional tempest raging inside. The news had landed like a physical blow, leaving her breathless and reeling. The shock had given way to a dull ache of uncertainty, a fear that gnawed at her insides. She clutched a worn photograph of her own mother, a bittersweet reminder of a past she now understood, yet still struggled to accept. The knock at the door was hesitant, almost apologetic. Ethan stood in the doorway, his eyes red-rimmed, his shoulders slumped with fatigue. He looked like a lost boy, his privileged world turned upside down. "Anya," he began, his voice a rough whisper. I don't know what to say." Anya looked up at him, her gaze searching. He saw the fear, the hurt, but also the lingering spark of love that defied the crushing weight of their impossible circumstances. And in that shared gaze, amidst the ruins of their world, a fragile hope began to bloom. The future remained uncertain, a vast and unknown landscape. But now, at least, they faced it together. The following days were a blur of hushed conversations and strained smiles. The Montgomery mansion, usually a vibrant hub of activity, felt like a mausoleum. Eleanor avoided Anya, her icy politeness a thin veil over simmering resentment. Richard, haunted by his past, retreated further into himself, his silence a heavy, suffocating presence. One evening, Ethan found Anya in the conservatory, the scent of lilies heavy in the air. She sat amidst the lush greenery, her hands resting gently on her swollen belly. The moonlight bathed her in a soft glow, highlighting the fragile beauty of her profile. He approached hesitantly, the gravel crunching under his shoes a stark contrast to the quiet intensity of the moment. "Anya," he began, his voice thick with unshed tears. I'm so sorry." She looked up, her eyes reflecting the moon's pale light. They held a depth of sorrow that mirrored his own. "It's not your fault, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rustling leaves. "It's theirs." He sat beside her, the cool stone bench a welcome respite from the emotional turmoil within him. He reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through him, a stark reminder of the love that defied the chaos around them. "But it changes everything," he murmured, his voice filled with despair. We can't be together." Anya's gaze fell to her stomach. "Our baby," she said, her voice barely a breath. "What about our baby?" The weight of that question hung between them, heavy and inescapable. The silence stretched, filled only with the rustling leaves and the soft chirping of crickets. The moon seemed to hold its breath, reflecting their shared anguish. He looked at her, his heart aching with a love that was both profound and forbidden. The future felt uncertain, a path shrouded in darkness. But in that moment, sharing the burden of this impossible truth, a fragile, defiant hope flickered between them. He knew, with a certainty that defied logic, that they had to find a way. They had to find a way for their love, for their child, to survive the storm raging around them. The following days were a blur of strained silences and averted gazes. The Montgomery mansion, usually a vibrant tapestry of laughter and elegant chatter, felt suffocatingly still. Eleanor's icy politeness towards Anya was a fragile mask barely concealing the simmering resentment that pulsed beneath. Richard, his face etched with lines of guilt and regret, retreated into a shell of silence, his presence a heavy, suffocating weight in every room. One afternoon, Ethan found Anya in the sun-drenched conservatory, the scent of lilies and damp earth filling the air. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows, painting kaleidoscopic patterns on the polished floor. She sat amidst a riot of lush greenery, her hands gently cradling her swollen belly. The scene was idyllic, a stark contrast to the storm raging within the family. He approached cautiously, the gravel crunching under his feet a jarring intrusion into the peaceful stillness. "Anya," he began, his voice a low rumble, barely audible above the gentle hum of the greenhouse. I'm so sorry." Anya looked up, her eyes, usually sparkling with warmth and intelligence, now shadowed with a deep sadness. They held a quiet strength, a resilience that both amazed and broke his heart. "It's not your fault, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle rustling of leaves. "It's theirs." He sat beside her, the cool stone bench a welcome respite from the emotional turmoil that consumed him. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing lightly against hers. The simple touch sent a jolt of electricity through him, a painful reminder of the love that was now forbidden. But it changes everything, he murmured, his voice thick with despair. We can't be together. Anya's gaze drifted down to her belly, a delicate curve beneath her soft cotton dress. Our baby, she whispered, her voice trembling. What about our baby? The question hung in the air, heavy and inescapable. The silence stretched, broken only by the gentle hum of bees and the distant chirp of crickets. The weight of their shared predicament pressed down on them, a crushing burden. He looked at her, his heart aching with a love both profound and devastatingly impossible. The future felt like a treacherous path, shrouded in darkness and uncertainty. Yet, in that shared moment of sorrow, a fragile spark of defiance ignited within him. They had to find a way. They had to find a way to navigate this impossible situation. For their love, for their child, to survive the storm that threatened to consume them. The impossible truth hung heavy, but amidst the despair, a stubborn hope remained. The following weeks were a blur of hushed conversations and strained smiles. Eleanor's carefully crafted facade of polite indifference cracked only in private, revealing a raw, wounded fury. Richard, consumed by guilt, retreated further into his study, the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco a constant reminder of his past mistakes. Ethan, caught between his love for Anya and his family's vitriol, felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. One evening, he found Anya in the library, the soft glow of the fireplace illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. She sat curled in a plush armchair, a worn copy of Wuthering Heights open in her lap, the pages untouched. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and wood smoke. He sat beside her, the silence a heavy blanket. I've been thinking, he began, his voice barely a whisper, about the test, about everything. Anya looked up, her eyes filled with a quiet sadness that pierced him. Me too, she replied softly, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. It's a lot to process. He reached for her hand, his fingers tracing the delicate lines on her palm. The familiar comfort of her touch was a lifeline in the storm of their lives. We have to tell them, he said finally, the words heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. About the baby, about us. Anya's hand trembled in his. And risk what? She asked, her voice barely a breath. More hurt? More rejection? He couldn't deny the fear in her words. The fear was real, a tangible weight in the room, fueled by their family's open disdain. I don't know, he admitted, his voice raw with honesty. But we can't hide it forever. This isn't right. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on their faces, highlighting the deep worry etching itself onto their features. The weight of their secret pressed down on them, suffocating, yet also binding them together in a shared understanding. He knew they were facing a difficult path, one filled with uncertainty and conflict. But in that shared silence, amidst the shadows and flickering light, a stubborn resilience flickered. They had to find a way together. The following days were a blur of forced smiles and averted gazes. The Montgomery mansion, usually a vibrant hub of activity, felt suffocatingly silent, the air thick with unspoken accusations. Anya, usually so graceful and composed, moved with a hesitant fragility, her eyes constantly scanning the room, searching for signs of acceptance that never came. Eleanor's brittle politeness was a thin veneer barely concealing a simmering resentment. Richard, his face etched with a profound sadness, spent his days lost in his study, the only sound the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock, marking the slow passage of time. One afternoon, Ethan found Anya in the sunroom, cradling a small porcelain doll. The sunlight streamed through the leaded windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. She looked up, startled, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. It's just so much, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the gentle chirping of unseen birds outside. Ethan sat beside her, the cool marble of the window seat seeping into his skin. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, uncertain. I know, he murmured, his own throat tight with unshed tears. The weight of their secret, the fear of their family's reaction, pressed down on them both. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the distant hum of the house's central heating system. They don't understand, Anya said finally, her voice thick with emotion. They can't see past their own prejudices. Ethan nodded, his heart aching for her. I'm trying to make them see, he replied, his voice hoarse. But it's harder than I ever imagined. He squeezed her hand, offering what little comfort he could. The weight of their situation, the looming threat of their family's rejection, pressed heavily on them. The silence in the sunroom felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken fears and anxieties. The scent of lilies, usually so comforting, now felt oppressive, a symbol of the suffocating atmosphere of their shared secret. He knew they had to tell the truth, sooner rather than later. The fear of exposure was a constant shadow, hanging over their heads, threatening to consume them. But the thought of facing their family's wrath, the potential for more pain and rejection, was almost unbearable. Yet, the thought of continuing to live a lie, of hiding their love and their child, was even worse. They had to find a way to navigate the treacherous path ahead. Together, the days bled into one another, each marked only by the slow, agonizing tick of the grandfather clock. Anya's quiet grace had been replaced by a fragile stillness, her usually bright eyes shadowed with a deep, persistent worry. The opulent Montgomery mansion, once a symbol of effortless wealth, now felt like a gilded cage. The silence was the worst, a heavy blanket woven from unspoken accusations and simmering resentment. One evening, Richard found Anya in the library, curled up in a plush armchair, a worn copy of Wuthering Heights clutched in her hands. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with leather-bound books. He hesitated at the doorway, his heart heavy with a guilt that had become a constant companion. He cleared his throat, the sound brittle in the quiet room. Anya looked up, her eyes widening slightly at the sight of him. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the crackling fire. He approached cautiously, his footsteps echoing softly on the thick carpet. I wanted to apologize," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "for the way we've treated you." Anya didn't respond immediately, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken words and years of regret. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "An apology doesn't change anything, Richard. The DNA test, it changed everything." He sat beside her, the plush velvet sinking beneath his weight. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers before gently covering it. Her skin was cool and smooth beneath his touch. "I know," he murmured, his voice choked with emotion. "And I know that my actions have caused you immense pain. I never meant to hurt you." He paused, his throat tightening with unshed tears. "I should have been there for you from the beginning." Anya squeezed his hand, a small, almost imperceptible movement. "I understand," she said softly, "but understanding doesn't erase the hurt. It doesn't make the past disappear." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears, reflecting the firelight. "It doesn't change the fact that my family rejected me. It doesn't change the fact that Ethan and I—" She trailed off, her voice breaking. He drew her closer, his arm wrapping around her shoulders in a gesture of comfort and remorse. "My daughter," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "My lost daughter." The words hung heavy in the air, a stark admission of his past mistakes. The weight of his guilt pressed down on him, suffocating him. The fire crackled, a counterpoint to the silent grief that filled the room. The wait for the DNA results had been agonizing, but the truth, once revealed, was even more unbearable. The future stretched before them, uncertain and daunting, but for the first time, a sliver of hope pierced the darkness. They had a chance to heal, to rebuild, to finally confront the shadows of their past. The cold, sterile environment of the lab felt miles away from the opulent Montgomery mansion. The air hung heavy with the unspoken, a suffocating silence broken only by the rhythmic ticking of a clock, each second a hammer blow against Anya's fragile composure. Ethan sat beside her, his hand clasped tightly in hers, its warmth a meager comfort against the chilling uncertainty. The scent of antiseptic clung to the air, a stark contrast to the perfume of lilies that usually filled the Montgomery home. He squeezed her hand, his thumb stroking the back of her hand, trying to convey a strength he didn't feel. His own fear mirrored hers, a cold dread that coiled in his stomach. The weight of his family's prejudice pressed down on him, a heavy burden he carried alongside the burgeoning love for Anya. He hadn't anticipated the intensity of their reaction, the sheer venom laced in their accusations. Their disdain hadn't been a simple dislike. It had been a visceral rejection, fueled by a classism so ingrained it felt almost instinctive. "It feels like forever," Anya whispered, her voice barely above a breath, the words catching in her throat. Her eyes, usually sparkling with life, were clouded with fear and exhaustion. The vibrant silk scarf she usually wore was missing, leaving her vulnerable, exposed. Ethan leaned closer, his breath ghosting against her ear. "I know," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "But it will be over soon. We'll face whatever comes. Together." His words were a promise, a vow whispered into the echoing silence of the waiting room. The sterile white walls seemed to press in on them, amplifying the tension that hung heavy in the air. Outside, the muted sounds of the city thrummed, a distant counterpoint to the inner turmoil that consumed them. The clock ticked on, each second an eternity, as they waited for a truth that would shatter their world. The fluorescent lights of the waiting room hummed, a relentless drone against the silence. Anya's hand, still clasped in Ethan's, felt clammy. He squeezed it, his own palm slick with sweat. The scent of antiseptic, sharp and sterile, battled with the faint, lingering sweetness of Anya's perfume, a floral scent he'd come to associate with her quiet strength. He looked at her, truly looked at her, past the fear clouding her eyes. The vibrant scarf was gone, replaced by the vulnerable paleness of her throat. He saw the tremor in her hands, a subtle betrayal of the composure she so diligently maintained. "They'll be here soon," he whispered, his voice a low rumble meant to soothe, but trembling slightly. He didn't believe it himself. The weight felt infinite, a chasm of dread stretching between them and the unknown. Anya's lips trembled. What if they're wrong? Her voice, barely audible, was laced with a fragile hope he desperately wanted to believe in, but fear gnawed at the edges of his heart. The reality was far more terrifying. What if they weren't wrong? What if their suspicions were confirmed, and their love was condemned not only by her family but also by the cruel hand of fate? He leaned closer, his breath warm against her ear. "They won't be," he insisted, his voice raw with emotion. "We'll face it together, whatever it is." His words were a shield, a desperate attempt to ward off the icy tendrils of fear that snaked around them both. The rhythmic tick-tock of the clock, each beat a hammer blow against the fragile hope clinging precariously between them, intensified the mounting pressure. He needed to believe his own words, he needed to believe in their love, in their future. But the stark reality of their situation pressed down, a crushing weight threatening to bury them both. The waiting room, once merely a space, became a physical manifestation of their anxieties, the white walls closing in on them. Outside, the city hummed, indifferent to their plight. The silence remained their most formidable adversary, punctuated only by the relentless ticking of the clock. The door swung open, revealing a woman with a clipboard, her face impassive. The sterile scent of the hospital intensified, mingling with the faint metallic tang of fear in Anya's mouth. Ethan squeezed her hand again, the gesture a silent promise. The woman's voice, calm yet official, cut through the suffocating silence. "Mr. Montgomery, Miss Anya, please follow me." The hallway stretched before them, an endless white corridor leading to an unknown destination. Anya's steps felt leaden, each footfall echoing the heavy weight in her chest. Ethan, usually so composed, walked with a stiffness, his jaw clenched tight. The air hung heavy with unspoken anxieties, a palpable tension that vibrated between them. The doctor's office was smaller than expected, surprisingly intimate. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, painted stripes across the polished wood desk. The doctor, a kind-faced woman with weary eyes, sat behind it, a file resting before her. She offered them both a small, sad smile. "The results are conclusive," she began, her voice soft but firm, her words hanging in the air like fragile glass. "The DNA test confirms a paternal link between Mr. Richard Montgomery and Miss Anya Sharma." A silence descended, thick and suffocating, broken only by the gentle ticking of a clock on the wall, a metronome marking the passage of time, each tick a hammer blow to their fragile hope. Ethan's grip on Anya's hand tightened, his knuckles white. Anya stared at the doctor, her eyes wide, a mixture of disbelief and dawning comprehension dawning on her face. The air crackled with unspoken questions, with the weight of a revelation that shattered their world. "So, it's true," Anya whispered, her voice barely audible, the words sounding more like a question than a statement. A single tear traced a path down her cheek. Ethan reached out, gently wiping it away. The doctor nodded silently, her expression mirroring the shock and bewilderment that mirrored their own. The world outside the small office seemed to fade away, their reality confined to this single, life-altering moment. The waiting was over. The truth was here, but its impact was far more devastating than either of them could have imagined. The fluorescent lights above seemed to dim, casting a pale, unsettling glow on the three faces etched with disbelief, grief, and the dawning awareness of a past that had irrevocably changed their future. The silence in the small office was a tangible thing, heavy and suffocating. Sunlight, fractured by the blinds, cast stripes across the polished wood desk, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the air. Anya felt the tremor in Ethan's hand, a silent echo of the earthquake rumbling within her own chest. The doctor's words, though soft, held the weight of centuries. Paternal link. Richard Montgomery, her father. But how? Anya's voice, a mere breath, was swallowed by the silence. Tears, hot and unwilled, streamed down her cheeks, blurring the already hazy lines of reality. She looked at Ethan, his face pale, his eyes mirroring her own shock. The unspoken question hung between them, a chasm wider than the generational gap that suddenly yawned before them. Ethan squeezed her hand, the gesture clumsy and inadequate in the face of such a monumental revelation. I don't understand," he whispered, his voice rough with disbelief and a dawning horror. The privileged life he had always known, the carefully constructed world of wealth and comfort, felt like a flimsy house of cards, collapsing around them. His love for Anya, once so bright and unquestioned, was now tainted with the bitter taste of incest, a forbidden fruit he had unknowingly consumed. The doctor, sensing their distress, cleared her throat. "The testing confirms a match. There's further documentation from Mr. Montgomery's college years. A past relationship." She paused, choosing her words carefully, mindful of the fragile emotional state of the young couple. The weight of the untold story hung in the air, thick and oppressive. Anya's mind raced, piecing together fragmented memories, fleeting glimpses of a life she had never known. The comfortable life she had built, the carefully constructed walls of her quiet dignity and independence threatened to crumble. Her love for Ethan, the man who had shown her kindness and acceptance, was now a treacherous minefield of tangled emotions and painful truths. "My father," Anya whispered, more to herself than anyone else, her voice cracking with the weight of the revelation. The implications were staggering. Her whole life, the choices she had made, were now inextricably linked to this man, to the wealthy family she'd served. The carefully guarded secrets of the Montgomery family now stood revealed, tearing at the very fabric of their lives. The shock, the disbelief, the overwhelming surge of emotions left her breathless, leaning heavily on Ethan for support. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the opulent floral arrangements adorning the waiting room. Eleanor Montgomery, her face a mask of controlled fury, paced restlessly. Richard, slumped in a leather armchair, stared blankly at the polished floor, his usually impeccably groomed hair disheveled. The silence, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, was a palpable entity, amplifying the anxiety simmering beneath the surface. Ethan sat beside Anya, his hand clasped tightly in hers, his usual arrogance replaced by a vulnerability that both frightened and captivated her. "This is unbelievable." Eleanor finally broke the silence, her voice tight with barely suppressed rage. "My son with the help." The word help hung in the air, laced with contempt. Richard finally looked up, his eyes bloodshot and weary. "Eleanor, please," he pleaded, his voice hoarse. "We need to understand." His gaze drifted to Anya, who sat stiffly, her eyes fixed on her clasped hands. The vibrant color usually present in her cheeks had faded, leaving her face pale and drawn. Ethan squeezed Anya's hand again, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. "It's going to be okay," he whispered. Though the words sounded hollow even to his own ears, he knew it wasn't okay. Nothing would ever be okay again. The revelation had shattered the carefully constructed world he knew, leaving him adrift in a sea of confusion and grief. The love he felt for Anya, once a source of joy, now felt contaminated, tainted by the impossible truth of their shared blood. Anya's silence was as deafening as Eleanor's outburst. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, crushing her spirit. The doctor's words echoed in her ears, a cruel symphony of disbelief and despair. Her carefully constructed life, the quiet dignity she had cultivated, was being dismantled piece by piece, revealing a past she'd never known and a future shrouded in uncertainty. She glanced at Ethan, her gaze searching his, seeking some reassurance, some shred of hope amidst the ruins of their world. But all she saw was the same reflection of her own shock, a shared burden of a truth so impossible, it felt like a cruel joke. The world tilted on its axis, its familiar landmarks dissolving into a blurry, terrifying landscape. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed, each toll a hammer blow against the fragile silence. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon sun, slicing through the opulent waiting room. Eleanor, her perfectly coiffed hair a stark contrast to the turmoil raging within, finally sat, the rigidity of her posture betraying her inner struggle. Richard reached for her hand, his touch hesitant, unsure. "It's a daughter," he whispered, his voice raspy, the words hanging heavy in the air like a suffocating shroud. The truth, once a whispered possibility, now roared in their ears, a monstrous wave threatening to drown them all. Ethan, his hands still intertwined with Anya's, felt the tremor in her fingers. He squeezed, offering silent comfort, though he felt anything but comforted himself. The love he'd felt for Anya, incandescent and pure, now felt shadowed, tainted by a shared lineage he never could have imagined. Anya, her gaze fixed on the worn Persian rug beneath her feet, felt the cold seep into her bones. The doctor's words, clinical and detached, played on a cruel loop in her mind. The wealthy Montgomery family, the life she'd built, it all felt fragile, built on shifting sand. A past she never knew was now an avalanche, burying her in its icy grip. "A daughter?" Eleanor repeated, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. Her voice, though low, carried a sharp edge, the venom of years of unspoken prejudice barely contained. The subtle disdain she'd always held for Anya now bloomed into a full-blown storm. The class chasm that had separated them, once a mere crack in the foundation, had become a gaping maw ready to swallow them whole. Richard's gaze drifted to Anya, searching for some sign of understanding, of forgiveness, perhaps. He saw only a quiet devastation, a stoicism that mirrored his own internal torment. He'd fathered a child, abandoned her, and now his son loved her. The irony, the cruel hand of fate, pressed down on him, heavy and unforgiving. Guilt gnawed at him, a persistent, bitter ache in his soul. The opulent surroundings, usually a source of comfort and pride, now felt like a gilded cage. Ethan looked from Anya to his parents, the the weight of their collective grief pressing down on him. He felt the fissure in his own carefully constructed world, the fracture running deep. His love for Anya remained fierce and untamed, but now laced with a complicated sorrow that threatened to consume him. The future, once bright with promise, was now a landscape of uncertainty, marked by a tragedy he never saw coming. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, a testament to the monumental shift in their lives. The comfortable world of privilege was gone, replaced by an agonizing truth. The doctor's words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Anya felt Ethan's hand tighten in hers, a silent reassurance against the storm brewing around them. The opulent waiting room, usually a sanctuary of comfort, felt cold and sterile. Sunlight, filtering through the tall windows, cast long shadows across the polished floor, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the stillness. Eleanor's carefully constructed composure began to unravel. A single tear traced a path through her expertly applied makeup. "A daughter?" Richard repeated, the word catching in his throat. Laced with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror, he looked at Anya, his gaze searching, desperate for some kind of explanation, some solace in the face of this impossible truth. But Anya's face remained impassive, a mask of controlled shock. The quiet dignity she always carried felt amplified, almost defiant, in the face of their stunned silence. Ethan squeezed Anya's hand again, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. His love for her, once a bright flame, now flickered uncertainly, threatened by the seismic shift in their reality. He couldn't comprehend this new truth, this cruel twist of fate that transformed their passionate love into a forbidden longing. The weight of their family's expectations, the crushing burden of their prejudices, pressed down on him, threatening to suffocate him. Eleanor's voice, when it finally broke the silence, was brittle, laced with a bitterness that surprised even herself. How could this be?" she whispered, the question aimed at Richard, but echoing the unspoken doubt in all their hearts. Her carefully maintained facade of composure crumbled, revealing the raw pain and confusion beneath. Years of ingrained biases, of unspoken class distinctions, now rose to the surface, threatening to overwhelm them all. Richard remained silent, his gaze fixed on Anya. The years melted away, revealing the ghost of a younger man, reckless and irresponsible, haunted by a past he'd tried so desperately to bury. The weight of his unspoken guilt was palpable, a heavy cloak draped across his shoulders. He saw the young woman he'd abandoned, the life he'd stolen, mirrored in the woman his son loved. The irony was a cruel blade twisting in his gut. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, broken only by the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Each tick was a hammer blow against the shattered fragments of their lives, each toll a reminder of the impossible truth that had irrevocably altered their destinies. The opulent room, their sanctuary of privilege, suddenly felt like a prison, its gilded cage trapping them in the aftermath of a truth too shattering to bear. The mahogany desk in Richard's study felt cold beneath his hands. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, usually comforting, now choked him. He stared at the DNA report, the stark black print blurring through a film of unshed tears. His past, meticulously buried for decades, clawed its way to the surface, raw and unforgiving. Eleanor found him there, the quiet rustle of her silk dress a stark contrast to the storm raging within him. "Richard," she began, her voice tight with unshed tears. The carefully maintained composure of the past decades had cracked, revealing the woman beneath, vulnerable, hurt, and bewildered. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot. I don't know what to say, Eleanor." His voice was a rough whisper, the words catching in his throat. The guilt was a physical weight, crushing him beneath its burden. Eleanor's hand rested briefly on his shoulder, a gesture both hesitant and desperate. "It's Anya," she breathed, her voice barely audible, the word heavy with unspoken accusations and nascent understanding. "Our prejudice. It was wrong." A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. The next few days were a blur of strained conversations, hushed whispers, and averted gazes. The Montgomery mansion, once a symbol of their opulent life, felt suffocating, each ornate room a silent witness to their crumbling world. Ethan, meanwhile, found solace only in Anya's presence. The weight of their shared secret pressed down on them, heavier than any societal judgment. "It's different now," Ethan said one evening, sitting beside Anya on the sun-drenched porch, the scent of honeysuckle heavy in the air. His eyes, usually bright with mischief, were clouded with worry. Being siblings, Anya's smile was tentative, a delicate bloom amidst the storm. "Yes," she replied softly, her fingers tracing patterns on his hand. "But the love, it doesn't just disappear." Her voice was barely a whisper, yet it held a strength that belied her soft tone. The vulnerability in her eyes was matched by the love that shone through. The air crackled with unspoken longing, a bittersweet symphony of love and loss. The setting sun cast long shadows, painting the scene in shades of orange and purple, reflecting the complex emotions that swirled between them. The future stretched before them, uncertain yet filled with the promise of a love that had defied their familial bonds. The weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air, thick and suffocating like the humid summer air clinging to the mansion's walls. Richard paced his study, the polished mahogany floor gleaming under the afternoon sun. Each step echoed the turmoil within him: guilt, shame, a profound sense of loss that resonated through decades of carefully constructed denial. Eleanor sat by the window, the intricate lace of her curtains mirroring the delicate threads of their unraveling marriage. Silence stretched between them, broken only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. "It's unbelievable," Eleanor finally whispered, her voice raspy, her gaze fixed on the distant garden. The vibrant hues of the blooming roses seemed to mock her inner turmoil. Richard stopped pacing, his shoulders slumped. "I never knew. I was so young, so reckless. I never imagined." His voice trailed off, the words inadequate to express the chasm of regret that opened within him. The scent of lilies, Eleanor's favorite, seemed to intensify, a cruel reminder of their idyllic facade, now shattered beyond repair. He moved towards her, his hand hovering uncertainly near hers. The touch of his fingers, once so familiar, now felt alien, burdened with the weight of unspoken accusations and years of deception. I should have found her," he mumbled, his voice thick with unshed tears. Eleanor turned, her eyes brimming with a complex mix of anger, hurt, and a dawning understanding. "And what about us, Richard? What about the life we built on a lie?" The question hung in the air, unanswered, as sharp and piercing as a shard of glass. The opulent surroundings, the Persian rugs, the antique furniture, seemed to mock their despair, highlighting the hollowness at the heart of their meticulously crafted world. The unspoken question lingered. How could they rebuild when the foundation itself had crumbled? The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, a symbolic representation of the darkness that had crept into their lives. The future, once so clearly defined, now stretched before them, uncertain and daunting, filled with the wreckage of their past and the terrifying unknown of their future. The Montgomery mansion, usually a haven of hushed elegance, throbbed with a low hum of unspoken anxieties. Richard, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion, sat alone in his study, the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco clinging to the air like a shroud. He stared at a framed photograph of a younger, carefree self, a stark contrast to the man staring back at him from the mirror. The guilt gnawed at him, a relentless tide eroding the foundations of his carefully constructed life. Eleanor, meanwhile, paced the opulent hallway, the soft whisper of her silk robe a fragile counterpoint to the storm raging within her. The once familiar comfort of her surroundings now felt alien, a gilded cage that trapped her in a web of her own prejudices. The vibrant colors of the Persian rugs seemed muted, dulled by the grayness of her despair. Their daughter, Catherine, found refuge in the sun-drenched conservatory, the fragrance of orchids momentarily soothing her frayed nerves. She watched, unseen, as her parents avoided each other, the chasm between them widening with each passing hour. The revelation had shattered not only their family dynamic but also the carefully constructed image Catherine had always held of her parents' perfect marriage. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, mirroring the silent tears falling in other rooms of the house. Later, in the dimly lit drawing room, Ethan found Anya cradling a mug of chamomile tea, her usual composure subtly fractured. The light glinted off the delicate silver band on her finger, a simple promise now burdened with an impossible weight. "It's a lot to take in," Ethan said softly, his voice barely a whisper above the crackling fireplace. Anya nodded, her gaze fixed on the swirling tea. "More than I ever imagined," she replied, her voice husky. The silence that followed was filled with a shared understanding, a silent acknowledgement of the upheaval that had turned their world upside down. The weight of their shared secret, the knowledge of their half-sibling bond, hung heavy in the air, a palpable presence between them. The future, once bright with the promise of their love, now lay shrouded in uncertainty. Yet, in the depths of their shared despair, a flicker of hope remained, a fragile flame, threatened by the storm, but stubbornly persistent. The mahogany desk in Richard's study felt cold beneath his fingertips. The scent of his father's pipe tobacco, usually comforting, now felt suffocating. He reread the DNA report, the stark black and white words blurring through his unshed tears. The weight of 20 years of silence, of a life deliberately obscured, pressed down on him with crushing force. Eleanor's absence was a physical ache. He'd seen the fear in her eyes, the rigid control she fought to maintain. He knew she needed time, but the silence between them was a chasm, vast and isolating. He heard the soft click of the door, then Eleanor's hesitant footsteps. She stood in the doorway, her face pale, her usually immaculate hair slightly disheveled. The silk of her robe, usually a symbol of her composure, hung limply. "Richard," she whispered, her voice tight with unshed tears. I don't understand. How could this happen?" He rose, crossing the room to take her hand. Her skin was cold. I don't know, Eleanor. It was a mistake. A terrible mistake I made so long ago." He squeezed her hand, the gesture clumsy, inadequate in the face of her pain. He felt her trembling. "A mistake?" she echoed, her voice barely above a breath. "A mistake that created this." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the upheaval their lives had become. "Anya, Ethan, our family." "I've been a fool," he admitted, his voice thick with regret. "A selfish, arrogant fool. I never considered the consequences." He looked at her, searching for some glimmer of understanding, some sign that they could navigate this storm together. The faint scent of lavender from her perfume, usually a source of quiet comfort, only served to amplify the despair hanging heavy in the air. The silence between them was deafening, broken only by the ticking grandfather clock in the corner, each tick a painful reminder of the time lost, the choices made, and the life irrevocably altered. The weight of their unspoken words hung heavy between them, a tangible barrier in their once familiar space. The future, once a clear path, now seemed shrouded in a fog of uncertainty and fear. The hushed atmosphere of Anya's room felt heavy with unspoken words. Sunlight, filtering through the lace curtains, illuminated dust motes dancing in the air, mirroring the turmoil swirling within Ethan. He sat on the edge of the bed, the worn floral comforter cool beneath his fingertips. Anya, pale but composed, traced patterns on her swollen belly. The silence between them hummed with 1,000 unsaid things. "It's strange," Anya finally said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. The words hung in the air, fragile as spun glass. Ethan nodded, unable to find his voice. Strange didn't begin to cover it. The news had shattered their world, transforming their passionate love into the awkward territory of half-siblings. The weight of their shared blood, their shared past, a past he hadn't known existed, pressed down on them both. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. He longed to touch her, to feel the familiar comfort of her presence, but hesitated, unsure of the boundaries now drawn between them. The scent of her lavender soap, usually so comforting, now felt bittersweet, a poignant reminder of what they'd lost. Do you regret it?" Anya asked, her eyes meeting his. The question hung between them, sharp and painful. He shook his head fiercely. "Never, not for a second." "But," he trailed off, the words catching in his throat. The future, once a bright canvas of shared dreams, now seemed a confusing maze of uncertainty. The image of their child, a tangible symbol of their love, now felt tangled with the complexities of their newfound reality. Anya's fingers brushed against his, a silent reassurance. "Me neither," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "But it's different now, isn't it?" Her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Our love, it's complicated." He squeezed her hand gently. "Complicated is an understatement, but it's still there. It has to be." He knew he spoke more to reassure himself than her. The realization that their love story was now a different kind of story, one of siblings facing an impossible situation, was a burden too heavy to bear alone. Yet, in her hand, in the quiet intimacy of their shared pain, he found a flicker of hope. The future remained uncertain, but within the shared sorrow, a new kind of bond began to form. A bond not of lovers, but of family. A bond forged in the crucible of an impossible truth. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air of the hospital waiting room. Ethan paced, the polished marble floor cold beneath his bare feet. He ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, the exhaustion etched deep in his eyes. Anya's labor had been long and difficult, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor a relentless counterpoint to the gnawing anxiety in his chest. He hadn't seen her since the doctor had ushered him out, the strained look on the doctor's face a chilling omen. He glanced at his phone, the screen displaying a flurry of unanswered texts from his mother. Eleanor's frantic messages were a stark contrast to the silent, heavy grief that weighed him down. This baby, this child he both longed to meet and dreaded, was a living testament to a love story twisted into an impossible knot. A nurse emerged, her face carefully neutral. "Mr. Montgomery?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. Ethan's heart lurched. He stood, his legs unsteady, and followed her down a long, sterile corridor. The air grew heavier, the silence amplifying the frantic beat of his own heart. He felt Anya's absence like a physical wound, a gaping hole in the world. He found Anya in a private room, bathed in the soft glow of a bedside lamp. She was pale, her breathing shallow, but a fragile smile played on her lips as she gazed at the tiny infant nestled against her chest. The baby, a perfect miniature of Anya, stirred, letting out a soft sigh. "He's beautiful," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He approached cautiously, hesitant to intrude on this sacred moment. The scent of baby powder and Anya's lavender soap filled the air, a comforting blend that still carried the bittersweet weight of their changed reality. "He's perfect," Anya replied, her voice raspy but filled with a love so profound it transcended the complicated reality of their circumstances. She reached out, her hand finding his, their fingers intertwined, the familiar touch of comfort, but with a quiet understanding of the unspoken. Their love had transformed. The future, still uncertain, now held the promise of a shared bond, a shared responsibility, a shared love for this new life that defied the impossible circumstances of its conception. The weight of their past actions, the mistakes of their family, loomed large, but in this shared space, in this new life, a fragile hope bloomed. The sterile white of the hospital room felt suffocating. Ethan sat beside Anya, the rhythmic squeak of the hospital bed a constant reminder of the fragility of their new reality. Anya's hand, still pale and thin, rested on their son's tiny head. The baby, a miniature version of Anya with Ethan's dark eyes, slept soundly. The air hummed with a low thrum of unspoken anxieties. "He's perfect," Ethan whispered, his voice catching in his throat. He couldn't look away from the sleeping child, a physical manifestation of their forbidden love, their shared secret. Anya squeezed his hand, a faint smile playing on her lips. "He has your eyes?" she murmured, her voice soft but firm. The simple statement hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The eyes that had once reflected a passionate love now mirrored a complicated familial bond. A wave of guilt washed over Ethan. He thought of his parents, their initial outrage, their subsequent stunned silence, their simmering resentments. He'd never fully forgiven their prejudice, their demand for the DNA test, the cruel whispers of impurity and class. But seeing Anya now, worn but radiant, holding their child, a profound shift occurred within him. His love for Anya remained as strong as ever, but it was now entwined with a deeper, more profound empathy. "We need to tell them," Anya said, breaking the silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it held an unwavering resolve. The weight of their shared secret pressed down on them both. Ethan nodded, his throat tight. The thought of facing his parents, of explaining everything, was terrifying. Yet the silence, the secrecy, felt far more suffocating. They needed to break the silence, to confront the past and shape their future. The burden of their secret, of their family's prejudice, was too heavy to bear alone. This tiny sleeping baby deserved a family that could accept him, unconditionally. Their child's future depended on their courage. The quiet hum of the hospital filled the air as Ethan looked at his son and Anya, and understood. This was the beginning of their long journey to forgiveness and acceptance. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but for the first time since the revelation, a flicker of hope illuminated the darkness. The Montgomery mansion felt colder than usual, the vast spaces echoing with unspoken tensions. Ethan sat across from Anya in the library, the scent of old leather and dust heavy in the air. He nervously traced the rim of his teacup, the delicate china cold against his fingertips. Anya, surprisingly calm, observed him, her gaze soft yet unwavering. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, punctuated only by the ticking grandfather clock in the hall. "It's different now," Ethan finally said, his voice low. He avoided Anya's eyes, focusing instead on the intricate carvings on the table. "Being siblings, it changes everything." Anya nodded, a faint smile touching her lips. "It does. But some things, some feelings, they don't disappear just because of a blood test." Her voice was quiet, but the conviction in her tone was undeniable. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his. The simple touch sent a jolt through him, a strange mix of familiarity and longing. He met her gaze then, his heart aching. The love was still there, undeniably present, but tinged with a profound sadness. The forbidden nature of their relationship, once a thrilling secret, was now a heavy burden. The reality of their shared heritage forced a painful reevaluation of their connection. "I keep thinking about the day we found out," Ethan confessed, his voice cracking slightly. "Your fear, my own denial, it was all so ugly." Anya squeezed his hand gently. "We were both victims of other people's prejudices, Ethan. Your family's, yes, but also my own past. The secret I've carried for so long." She looked away for a moment, a shadow passing over her face. The weight of her unspoken past hung heavy in the air. The future, once so bright and clear, was now a complex tapestry woven with threads of love, guilt, and the daunting task of navigating their new familial reality. The tea grew cold in their cups, a testament to the passage of time and the unspoken words that still lingered between them. The family's attempts at damage control were clumsy, almost comical in their desperate ineptitude. Eleanor, usually impeccably composed, hosted a disastrous luncheon, her forced smiles strained, her attempts at casual conversation jarring against the palpable tension hanging in the air like smoke. The crystal clinked against porcelain, a brittle symphony mirroring the fracturing family dynamic. Richard, attempting a jovial air, only succeeded in making himself seem more out of touch. His forced laughter grated on Anya's nerves, the hollow sound a stark contrast to the genuine warmth she'd hoped for. "It's a peculiar situation, isn't it?" Richard chuckled, a brittle sound that failed to mask the unease in his eyes. He nervously adjusted his cufflinks, expensive gold glinting in the harsh sunlight streaming through the bay window. Ethan watched them, a knot tightening in his stomach. The carefully constructed facade of normalcy felt brittle, threatening to crumble at any moment. He caught Anya's eye and saw the weariness etched onto her face. The weight of their situation pressed heavily on them both. Later, alone in the vast expanse of her bedroom, Anya stared at the framed photo of a younger Richard, his carefree grin a cruel mockery of the present. The scent of lavender from her hand cream, a small comfort in the overwhelming turmoil, did little to soothe her. He had looked so happy then, so unaware of the life he'd abandoned. Tears welled up in her eyes, blurring the picture's detail. The pain was not just from the rejection of her family, but from the father she never knew, the life she never had. The next morning, Eleanor made a feeble attempt at amends. She found Anya in the sunroom, tending to the vibrant orchids. The humid air hung heavy with the scent of the flowers, a stark contrast to the icy atmosphere that had enveloped the house. "Anya," Eleanor began, her voice tentative, I want to apologize. My behavior has been unacceptable." The words felt clumsy, inadequate, yet sincerity shone through the cracks of her carefully constructed composure. Anya turned, her expression guarded. "It's all right, Mrs. Montgomery." The stiffness of her words betrayed her true feelings. The hurt ran too deep for easy forgiveness. Eleanor reached out, her hand hovering over Anya's arm, the hesitation evident. It was a tentative step towards reconciliation, a fragile bridge built across a chasm of prejudice and misunderstanding. The silence that followed, however, held more weight than any words could convey. The future remained uncertain, the path ahead fraught with challenges. Yet in this small gesture, a glimmer of hope flickered, fragile but persistent. The weight of unspoken words and buried emotions still lingered, but the air, ever so slightly, began to thaw. The heavy oak door to Richard's study closed with a soft thud, the silence amplifying the unspoken tension. Richard paced, the Persian rug whispering beneath his expensive loafers. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of his control, felt oppressive. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the scent of his expensive aftershave a bitter reminder of his privileged life, now tainted by a truth too shocking to bear. Eleanor sat rigidly in a wingback chair, the floral print of its upholstery a stark contrast to the storm raging within her. "How could I?" he began, his voice a low murmur lost in the cavernous room. The scent of old books and leather bound his confession, a suffocating aroma mirroring his guilt. Eleanor's silence was a wall, impenetrable. Her perfectly applied makeup couldn't mask the tremor in her hand as she sipped her lukewarm tea. The delicate china, a wedding gift, felt fragile in her grasp, mirroring the fragility of her marriage. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hallway. "It was a different time," Richard finally offered, the words inadequate, pathetic. He stopped pacing, his shoulders slumping. The weight of his past mistakes seemed to physically crush him. The memory of a younger, reckless self, a fleeting college romance, now felt like a betrayal of the life he'd carefully constructed. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice low and controlled. "A different time? Richard, you abandoned your own daughter. You left her to a life. Her voice cracked, the carefully maintained composure shattered. Tears welled in her eyes, not just for Anya's plight, but for the shattered image of the man she'd married. The room felt colder, the opulent surroundings suddenly mocking. The afternoon sun, once warm, now cast long, accusing shadows. Richard moved to her, his hand reaching out, then withdrawing. The unspoken question hung heavy in the air. Could they navigate this storm together, or would it tear them apart? The future, once so certain, now blurred, uncertain, painted in hues of regret and the harsh reality of a truth brutally revealed. The Montgomery family's opulent dining room, usually a stage for polished conversation and laughter, felt like a mausoleum. The scent of lilies, usually Eleanor's favorite, now hung heavy, cloying. Richard, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond the years, pushed his untouched roast beef around his plate. Eleanor picked listlessly at her asparagus, her usual elegant demeanor replaced by a brittle stiffness. Ethan, his youthful exuberance dimmed, stared at his hands, his knuckles white as he gripped his wine glass. Anya, her usual gentle smile absent, sat quietly, her pregnancy subtly evident in the gentle curve of her belly. The silence, thick and suffocating, was broken only by the clinking of silverware. This changes everything," Eleanor finally said, her voice a strained whisper. The words hung in the air, fragile and accusatory. Richard looked up, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were filled with a raw, unfamiliar vulnerability. "I know," he replied, his voice barely above a breath. The weight of his unspoken confession hung heavy in the room, a palpable presence. Ethan, unable to bear the suffocating silence any longer, spoke, his voice tight with emotion. "It doesn't have to. Anya's still Anya, and she's my sister." He looked at Anya, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and bewilderment. The unspoken question, how could they navigate this, hung in the air. Anya, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears, reached across the table, her hand covering his. The simple gesture, laden with unspoken understanding, created a brief moment of shared pain and fragile hope. "I'm still here," she said softly, her voice laced with a strength that surprised even herself. The gentle pressure of her hand on his, a silent promise of unwavering support, was a lifeline in the turbulent sea of their altered reality. The room remained heavy, but a single ray of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the delicate connection between the two lovers, now brother and sister. The future was uncertain, filled with obstacles and questions yet to be answered. But in this moment, amidst the wreckage of their old world, a new, fragile hope began to take root. The following days were a blur of hushed conversations, strained smiles, and averted gazes. Eleanor, usually the picture of controlled elegance, retreated into a brittle shell, her sharp words laced with a bitterness that surprised even herself. Richard, haunted by the ghost of his past, sought solace in his study, the quiet hum of the antique grandfather clock a mournful counterpoint to his turmoil. He found himself staring at old photographs, his younger self laughing carefree, a stark contrast to the man he was now. The guilt was a physical weight, pressing down on him. Ethan, torn between his love for Anya and his loyalty to his family, oscillated between furious outbursts and crippling silence. He paced his room, the plush carpet a poor substitute for the restless energy consuming him. The opulent furnishings mocked his inner turmoil. Anya, meanwhile, maintained a stoic quietude, her pregnancy a constant reminder of the impossible situation. She spent her days tending to her own inner turmoil, avoiding the family's searching gazes, finding comfort only in the hushed moments of quiet reflection. The gilded cage of the Montgomery mansion felt more like a prison. One afternoon, Eleanor attempted a clumsy apology, a forced smile betraying the tremor in her voice. "Anya," she began, her voice strained. I've been thinking. What I said, it was wrong. Horribly wrong." The words hung in the air, awkward and insufficient. Anya met her gaze, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding that cut deeper than any accusation. "I know," Anya replied, her voice soft. "But it's not just about your words, Mrs. Montgomery. It's about all the unspoken things, the assumptions." A tear traced a path down her cheek. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken regrets and the weight of inherited prejudices. Later that evening, Ethan found Anya by the fountain in the garden, the soft glow of the setting sun painting the scene in hues of orange and gold. He sat beside her, avoiding her gaze, the silence a comfortable refuge from the storm raging within him. "I don't know what to do," he finally confessed, his voice thick with emotion. Anya turned, her eyes mirroring his despair. "Neither do I, Ethan," she whispered, her hand finding his. The unspoken acknowledgement of their impossible situation hung between them, heavier than the twilight air. The fountain's gentle murmur was a poignant counterpoint to their shared sorrow. The future, once bright with promise, now felt shrouded in an uncertain, yet strangely unifying, darkness. The opulent Montgomery dining room, usually a stage for lavish dinners, felt cold and empty. Anya sat stiffly, the ornate silver cutlery gleaming coldly against the crisp white tablecloth. The aroma of untouched roast beef hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the tension that crackled between her and the Montgomery family. Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that went beyond the usual societal mask, avoided eye contact. Richard, his usually jovial face grim, picked listlessly at his food. Only Ethan's gaze remained fixed on Anya, his expression a mixture of guilt and unwavering devotion. "Anya," Richard began, his voice raspy, we need to talk about the future." His words lacked their usual authority, revealing the turmoil within. Anya met his gaze, her eyes unwavering. "I understand, Richard," she replied, her voice quiet but steady. The slight tremble in her hands, however, betrayed the turmoil she carefully concealed. The weight of their shared secret, the burden of his past, pressed down upon her. The crystal chandelier above shimmered, its light unable to pierce the suffocating atmosphere. Ethan reached across the table, his hand covering Anya's. The gesture, small yet significant, spoke volumes of his unwavering support. Eleanor flinched, a subtle recoil that spoke of her unresolved prejudice. The unspoken accusations, the judgments, hung like a shroud in the room. This changes everything," Eleanor finally said, her voice tight with unshed tears. The carefully constructed facade of the Montgomery family was crumbling, revealing the cracks beneath. The weight of their unspoken resentments, the legacy of their ingrained biases, threatened to overwhelm them all. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions, the unspoken fear of the unknown future. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall seemed to amplify the silence, each tick a hammer blow against their fragile peace. The ornate room, usually a symbol of their wealth and status, felt like a suffocating prison. Anya felt a wave of nausea, the emotional turmoil threatening to spill over. She squeezed Ethan's hand, finding a small comfort in his unwavering presence. The future was uncertain, but in his hand, she found a fragile anchor in the storm. The following days were a blur of strained silences and averted gazes. Richard, usually the boisterous patriarch, retreated into a shell of guilt, his booming laughter replaced by hushed whispers and restless pacing. Eleanor, her elegant composure fractured, oscillated between icy disdain and fleeting moments of hesitant empathy. The opulent mansion, once a symbol of their effortless privilege, felt suffocating, each echoing hallway a reminder of their fractured unity. One evening, Anya found Ethan in the library, surrounded by scattered law books. The soft glow of the lamps illuminated the worried lines etched around his eyes. He looked up, his expression a mixture of love and apprehension. They're talking about legal options," he whispered, the words heavy with unspoken implications. "Prenuptial agreements, custody battles." Anya's breath hitched. The scent of old leather and aged paper couldn't mask the bitter tang of betrayal that filled the air. "They're treating this like a business deal," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, the words catching in her throat. The weight of their situation pressed down on her, the joy of her pregnancy overshadowed by a gnawing fear. Ethan rose, his chair scraping against the polished wood floor. He crossed the room, pulling her gently into his arms. The warmth of his embrace was a fragile comfort against the chilling reality of their situation. "Don't listen to them," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "They're hurting, confused, they're scared." His words, meant to reassure, only served to underscore the depth of their predicament. The chasm between them, once bridged by love, now seemed unfathomably wide, filled with the ghosts of prejudice and the wreckage of family secrets. The soft ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner seemed to mock their fragile hope. Each tick a stark reminder of the relentless march of time. The weight of their shared secret, the burden of Richard's past, hung heavy in the air, a palpable presence that threatened to suffocate them both. Anya felt the silent tremor of his body, a reflection of his own turmoil. The future, once a bright promise, now felt shrouded in uncertainty, its path obscured by the shadows of their family's deep-seated issues. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the arched windows of Anya's small, sparsely furnished room, a stark contrast to the opulence of the rest of the house. She lay curled on the bed, the crisp white sheets a stark contrast to the turmoil within. The faint scent of lavender from the small bouquet Ethan had left the previous night did little to soothe her anxiety. She could still hear the echoes of Eleanor's sharp, brittle voice from the night before, laced with accusations barely veiled as concern. A soft knock echoed on the door. "Anya," Ethan's voice, hesitant and low. She swallowed, her throat dry. "Come in." He entered, his face pale, his eyes shadowed with exhaustion. He carried a tray with a steaming mug and a plate of toast, a simple gesture laden with unspoken care. I couldn't sleep," he mumbled, placing the tray on the bedside table. The clinking of the mug against the saucer sounded loud in the quiet room. Anya managed a weak smile. "Me neither." She took a sip of the tea, the warmth a fleeting comfort. They're still talking about lawyers?" Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on the floor. "Richard, he's obsessed with protecting the family name, the fortune. He sees this as a threat." His voice cracked slightly. "And Eleanor, she's caught between him and, well, everything." Anya understood. The weight of their secret was crushing them, threatening to shatter the fragile foundation of their love. The once vibrant joy of her pregnancy was now muted by the constant undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. "We need to fight this," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "We need to show them we're stronger than this." Ethan looked up, a flicker of hope in his eyes. He reached for her hand, his touch gentle, reassuring. "Together," he whispered, his voice raw with emotion. The unspoken promise hung between them, a fragile beacon in the storm raging around them. The fight had begun. The fight to save their love, their family, their future. The mahogany table in the Montgomery dining room felt cold beneath Anya's hands. The air, usually thick with the scent of expensive lilies, was heavy with unspoken accusations. Eleanor, her face etched with a weariness that belied her carefully maintained composure, meticulously buttered a croissant, the rhythmic scrape of the knife a counterpoint to the silence. Richard, his usually jovial face grim, stared into his coffee, the dark liquid mirroring the storm raging within him. Ethan, across from Anya, reached across the table, his hand covering hers. The simple gesture was a silent defiance against the icy atmosphere. Anya squeezed his hand, her own trembling slightly. "We need a lawyer," Richard finally said, his voice rough. This situation, it requires legal counsel." Eleanor looked up, her eyes darting between Anya and Richard. "But is it even necessary? We are family." Her voice was laced with a doubt she couldn't entirely conceal. The carefully constructed facade of upper-class composure was beginning to crack under the strain. Anya met Eleanor's gaze, her expression steady. "With all due respect, Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery," she began, her voice calm but firm. "This is not a family matter anymore. This is a legal one. My rights and Ethan's must be protected." The words hung in the air, sharp and precise. The silence that followed was punctuated only by the ticking grandfather clock in the hallway, each tick a hammer blow against the fragile peace. Ethan's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on his father, a mixture of anger and hurt simmering beneath his stoic exterior. He understood his father's need for control, for a legal shield against the threat this revelation posed to his carefully crafted image. But his loyalty was divided. Richard sighed, the sound a heavy weight settling on the tense atmosphere. "I understand, Anya, but this changes everything." His voice, usually booming with authority, was now laced with pain, regret, and the fear of the unknown. He looked at Ethan, a mixture of guilt and longing on his face. The breakfast, untouched, grew cold. The opulent setting felt like a gilded cage, trapping them all within the confines of their shared secrets and burgeoning resentments. The battle lines were drawn, not in legal documents, but in the strained silences, the averted gazes, the unspoken accusations that hung heavy in the air. The Montgomery mansion, usually a haven of quiet luxury, felt suffocating. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams slanting through the tall windows, illuminating the strained faces gathered in the library. Richard paced, the polished wood floor echoing his restless energy. Eleanor sat rigid in an armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the expensive silk of her dress offering no comfort. Ethan, pale and drawn, sat beside Anya, who held his hand, her fingers tracing the lines on his palm. The silence was punctuated only by the occasional ticking of the grandfather clock, each tick a hammer blow against their fragile peace. "This isn't just about lawyers," Anya finally said, her voice soft but steady, breaking the oppressive silence. Her gaze swept across their faces, lingering on each one before returning to Ethan. "It's about us, about our family." Ethan looked at her, a storm of emotions swirling in his eyes. He squeezed her hand, offering a silent affirmation of his unwavering support. But he also saw the fear behind her composure, the burden of their shared secret weighing heavily on her. Richard stopped pacing, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. "I failed you, Anya," he whispered, his voice thick with regret. "I failed you both." Eleanor looked up, tears welling in her eyes. The carefully constructed facade of her composure finally crumbled, revealing the raw pain and guilt gnawing at her. "We all failed you," she admitted, her voice choked with emotion. The words hung in the air, a fragile bridge between their fractured relationships. The weight of years of prejudice and denial began to lift, replaced by the painful weight of truth. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, hinting at the long, arduous path toward forgiveness and reconciliation that lay ahead. The silence that followed wasn't one of accusation, but a shared acknowledgement of the immense task before them, the beginning of healing. The days that followed were a blur of hushed conversations, strained smiles, and averted gazes. The Montgomery mansion, once a symbol of effortless elegance, felt like a gilded cage. Eleanor, usually impeccably composed, wandered through the house like a ghost, her eyes shadowed with a profound sadness. Richard, haunted by his past, sought solace in his study, the scent of old leather and pipe tobacco heavy in the air. Ethan, torn between his love for Anya and the fracturing of his family, found himself adrift, his usual confidence replaced by a gnawing uncertainty. One evening, Anya found Ethan in the conservatory, the scent of jasmine heavy in the humid air. He sat amongst the lush greenery, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the setting sun. He looked up as she approached, a flicker of guilt in his eyes. I'm sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely a whisper. Anya sat beside him, the cool ceramic of a nearby plant pot a welcome contrast to the warmth of his hand in hers. "For what?" she asked softly, her voice a soothing balm to his troubled soul. "For everything," he replied, his voice thick with emotion. "For the way my family treated you, for my own doubts, for everything." Anya squeezed his hand. "It wasn't your fault, Ethan. Their prejudices. They're theirs to bear." She paused, then added, her voice laced with a quiet strength. "But we need to find a way through this. For us, for the baby." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the vibrant colors of the flowers around them. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant sounds of crickets. It wasn't a silence of awkwardness, but one of shared understanding, of a bond forged in the crucible of their unexpected circumstances. A bond that, despite the complexities of their situation, felt stronger than ever before. The setting sun cast long shadows across the conservatory floor, a silent testament to the long, difficult road ahead, but also a faint promise of the light that might yet break through. They sat there, hand in hand, finding solace in each other's presence. Their shared future now undeniably intertwined. The Montgomery family's opulent dining room, usually a stage for lavish gatherings, felt eerily silent. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams slicing through the tall windows, illuminating the untouched silver and crystal. Eleanor, her usually flawless makeup smudged, stared at a half-eaten plate of untouched lobster thermidor. The scent of the uneaten meal mingled with the faint, lingering perfume of lilies, a stark contrast to the heavy air of unspoken tensions. Richard sat opposite her, his usually jovial face etched with lines of deep weariness. He picked at a loose thread on his expensive suit, a nervous habit he'd only recently adopted. The silence stretched, a tangible thing between them, punctuated only by the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall. "It's not right," Eleanor finally whispered, her voice barely audible above the tick-tock of the clock. Her gaze drifted to a framed photograph on the mantelpiece. A younger Richard, carefree and smiling, his arm around a young woman with dark, luminous eyes. "Anya." Richard flinched, his gaze following hers. "I know," he murmured, his voice thick with regret. I should have done things differently." Eleanor's shoulders slumped. "It's more than just the past, Richard. It's Ethan. And the baby." A single tear traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail through the carefully applied makeup. The weight of their unspoken anxieties hung heavy in the room. The guilt, the shame, the fear, all coalesced into an oppressive atmosphere, suffocating them both. The opulent setting offered no solace, no escape from the turmoil within. The silence, once comfortable, now felt like a condemnation. The once pristine surroundings seemed to mock their shattered composure. The sunlight, once welcoming, now cast long, accusing shadows across the room. Their carefully constructed world had crumbled, leaving behind only the wreckage of their prejudices and the painful truth of their past. The future, once clear, now lay shrouded in uncertainty. The days blurred into a relentless cycle of strained silences and simmering resentments. Ethan, usually the picture of carefree privilege, haunted the house like a ghost, his vibrant energy dimmed to a dull flicker. He avoided his parents, the unspoken accusations hanging heavier than the scent of lilies Eleanor insisted on keeping in every room. Anya, meanwhile, retreated to her small room, the once cheerful space now cloaked in a quiet sadness. The rhythmic tick of the grandfather clock became a relentless drumbeat, marking the passage of time and the slow unraveling of the Montgomery family. One evening, a storm raged outside, mirroring the tempest within the house. Rain lashed against the windows, the wind howling like a mournful spirit. Ethan found Anya in the library, curled up in a worn armchair, a book open in her lap but unread. He sat beside her, the silence comfortable in a way it hadn't been in days. "It's awful," Anya whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm's fury. She didn't need to specify what she meant. They both knew. Ethan reached for her hand, his touch tentative, uncertain. "I'm sorry," he murmured, the words catching in his throat. "For everything." Anya looked at him, her eyes mirroring the storm's gray intensity. "It's not your fault, Ethan," she said softly, squeezing his hand. "It's theirs. But it hurts." A single tear escaped, tracing a path down her cheek, swallowed by the soft wool of her sweater. He pulled her close, their embrace a silent refuge from the turmoil around them. The rain continued its relentless assault, a symphony of chaos that somehow felt strangely comforting in its shared sorrow. In that shared silence, in the shared grief, a fragile sense of connection began to mend the cracks in their shattered world. The storm raged on, but within the confines of the old library, a small flame of hope began to ignite, flickering against the darkness. The future remained uncertain, but in that shared moment of vulnerability, they found a strength neither could have imagined just days before. The weight of their secret remained, but in the face of the storm, they discovered a kinship stronger than any blood tie. The old photo album lay open on Richard's desk, its brittle pages whispering stories of a carefree youth. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunbeams, slicing through the heavy drapes, illuminating a younger Richard. His smile bright and reckless, arms slung around a laughing young woman with Anya's eyes. The image stabbed him anew, a fresh wound reopening after years of carefully constructed denial. He ran a trembling hand over the faded photograph, the weight of his past pressing down like a physical burden. Eleanor found him there, the silence of the study heavy with unspoken accusations and buried regrets. She didn't speak, just sat beside him, her hand resting lightly on his. The unspoken question hung between them. How could he have done this? The unspoken answer. He didn't know, didn't understand, until it was too late. She was beautiful, Richard finally whispered, his voice thick with emotion, barely a breath. He didn't need to specify who he meant. Eleanor already knew. Eleanor nodded, her gaze lingering on the photo, a flicker of something akin to understanding replacing the hardened anger that had dominated her for weeks. She looks like Anya, she said softly, a tremor in her voice. The raw pain, the years of suppressing her own prejudices, the shock of the revelation. It all seemed to be melting away, leaving behind a fragile space for empathy to blossom. The air thickened with the weight of their shared history, a history of secrets and omissions, of class-based prejudices and a youthful indiscretion that had irrevocably altered the course of 3 lives. The scent of old paper and leather filled the room, mingling with the faint aroma of lilies from the hallway, a constant reminder of their fractured world. Richard reached for Eleanor's hand, his touch tentative, seeking solace in her presence. The storm raging outside mirrored the emotional tempest within the walls of their opulent home. But this time, the storm felt different. It was shared, the shared burden of a truth finally exposed. The future remained uncertain, but within the stillness of the study, a fragile sense of connection began to mend the cracks in their shattered world. The mahogany desk, usually a symbol of Richard's power, now felt like a cold, imposing judge. He stared at the faded photograph, the young woman's laughter echoing in the silence of the study, a cruel phantom limb of a past he'd buried. The lilies Eleanor had placed, meant as a gesture of peace, felt suffocating, their sweet scent cloying in the heavy air. It wasn't intentional, he finally rasped, his voice barely audible above the ticking grandfather clock. The words hung in the air, thin and inadequate. Eleanor didn't respond immediately. She watched him, her expression unreadable, her fingers tracing the delicate rim of a chipped teacup. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes dancing in the golden rays, each a tiny, silent witness to their unspoken grief. I was young, Richard continued, his voice cracking, naive. I didn't even know she was pregnant. He looked up, his eyes searching hers for some measure of understanding, some sliver of forgiveness. I never meant to cause her any pain. A single tear traced a path down Eleanor's cheek, a stark contrast to her usually composed demeanor. The years of unspoken resentment, the carefully constructed facade of their marriage, threatened to crumble under the weight of this long-buried truth. And Anya? She whispered, her voice barely a tremor. The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken implications. The fear that gnawed at her, the fear that this revelation would shatter their family, that the life they had built together would disintegrate into dust. Richard closed his eyes, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The guilt, the regret was a physical thing, a leaden cloak suffocating him. He thought of Anya, her quiet strength, her unwavering dignity in the face of their cruelty. He had denied her her birthright, denied her a family, all for his own selfish reasons. The silence stretched, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the clock, each tick a hammer blow to his already shattered sense of self. The scent of the lilies intensified, now a bitter reminder of his failure, of the wounds he had inflicted and the long, arduous road to healing that lay ahead. The storm outside raged on, mirroring the chaos in their hearts. But amidst the tempest, a faint glimmer of hope flickered, a shared vulnerability that hinted at the possibility of forgiveness, of understanding, of a future built not on denial, but on the painful, difficult truth. The rain lashed against the library windows, mirroring the tempest in Richard's soul. He sat hunched over a leather-bound volume, the gilded lettering a cruel mockery of his gilded cage. The scent of old paper and damp earth clung to the air, a somber perfume for his self-imposed exile. Eleanor found him there, hours later, a single lamp illuminating the dust motes dancing in the beam. "Richard," she said softly, her voice raspy with unshed tears. The years etched into her face seemed deeper, sharper, highlighting the toll this truth had taken. He didn't look up, his fingers tracing the embossed lines of the book's spine. I should have told you," he finally whispered, his voice thick with regret. The words felt inadequate, pathetic in the face of her silent accusation. She sat beside him, the worn velvet of the armchair creaking under her weight. The silence stretched, pregnant with unspoken emotions. The rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall seemed to amplify the throbbing silence. Eleanor reached for his hand, her touch hesitant, yet firm. "It wasn't just about the money, was it?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. The question hung between them, heavy with the weight of years of unspoken resentments, of assumptions built on prejudice. Richard flinched. He knew she was right. It had been about his youthful arrogance, his fear of judgment, his inability to face the consequences of his actions. "No," he admitted, his voice choked with emotion. "It was fear." He looked up, his eyes brimming with unshed tears. Fear of losing everything. The confession hung in the air, stark and vulnerable. Eleanor squeezed his hand, a silent acknowledgement of his pain, of her own. The shared grief, the weight of their combined sorrow, seemed to momentarily bridge the chasm of years of unspoken hurt. Outside, the storm raged on. Inside, a fragile hope flickered, a tentative step towards forgiveness, a recognition of shared pain. The storm outside mirrored the one raging within them, but amidst the tempest, a tiny seed of understanding began to take root. The long road to healing stretched before them, arduous, but not insurmountable. The dusty attic air hung thick with the scent of mothballs and forgotten memories. Sunlight, fractured by grimy panes, illuminated swirling dust motes, each a tiny, dancing ghost of the past. Richard traced a finger along the faded floral pattern of a chipped porcelain doll, a relic from his own childhood. He felt a familiar pang of guilt, a sharp stab of regret. This attic, filled with the discarded remnants of his life, mirrored the fragmented pieces of his past he'd tried so hard to bury. A photograph, tucked into a cracked leather-bound journal, caught his eye. A younger Richard, carefree and handsome, his arm draped casually around a laughing young woman with eyes as dark as night. Anya's mother. The image vibrated with a bittersweet ache, a potent mixture of youthful exuberance and profound sorrow. He remembered the fiery passion, the reckless abandon of their brief, stolen moments. He remembered the fear that had propelled him to silence, to disappear. He remembered the devastating aftermath. The journal, brittle with age, fell open to a page filled with spidery handwriting. Richard's handwriting, a desperate, almost childish plea for forgiveness, a raw confession of his cowardice. He scanned the words, his eyes blurring with unshed tears. "Forgive me, my love. Forgive me, Anya." The journal slammed shut, the sound echoing in the oppressive silence. He swallowed hard, the lump in his throat constricting his breathing. He felt Eleanor's presence before he heard her, a silent understanding passing between them, a shared burden held for far too long. "It was her mother's," Eleanor said, her voice soft, almost reverent. "She looked just like her." The words were simple, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime of unspoken regrets. Richard nodded, his head bowed, his shoulders slumped with the weight of his revelation. The silence settled between them again, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the distant creak of the old house settling. He knew their journey toward reconciliation was just beginning, a long, arduous path littered with the thorns of past mistakes. But in the quiet solitude of the attic, amongst the ghosts of yesterday, a fragile hope began to bloom. A hope as fragile as a newborn's breath, yet powerful enough to suggest a future bathed in the warm glow of forgiveness. The sterile scent of antiseptic hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the floral perfume Anya usually wore. Sunlight streamed through the hospital window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness. Anya, pale but resolute, sat clutching a worn, leather-bound journal, Richard's journal. Ethan entered, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond simple fatigue. He carried a bouquet of lilies, their fragrance a fragile counterpoint to the clinical environment. "He wants to see you," Ethan said softly, his voice hoarse with unshed tears. He placed the lilies beside Anya, their white petals a stark reminder of the fragility of life. He's weakening." Anya nodded, her eyes brimming. The journal slipped from her numb fingers, landing silently on the crisp white sheets. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, a heavy cloak of responsibility. She had spent days wrestling with it, the truth about her relationship with Ethan, the truth about her father. The truth, sharp and brutal, had sliced through their fragile happiness. "I need to tell him," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. "Tell him what?" Ethan's voice was a strained breath. He sat beside her, his hand covering hers, offering silent comfort. The unspoken question hung heavy between them, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm that had opened between them. Anya looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of love and sorrow. "Tell him I can't be with him. Not like this. Not anymore." The words were a physical release, years of suppressed feelings finally finding their voice. The tears streamed down her face, hot and relentless. Ethan didn't speak. He simply held her hand tighter, his thumb stroking her knuckles in a gesture of comfort. The silence held a potent mixture of grief and understanding, a testament to their shared history, a painful acknowledgement of their broken future. The love remained, but its shape had been irrevocably altered, contorted by the impossible truth that bound them. The weight of their secret, once a suffocating burden, was now a painful reminder of choices made and futures irrevocably changed. The lilies, symbols of purity and remembrance, seemed to wilt under the weight of their sorrow. The mahogany table, usually gleaming under the chandelier's light, felt cold and unwelcoming. Anya sat opposite Eleanor, the silence punctuated only by the rhythmic tick-tock of a grandfather clock in the hall. The air hung heavy with unspoken accusations, a tangible manifestation of the family's simmering resentment. Eleanor's hands, usually adorned with expensive jewels, were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. I don't understand," Eleanor finally said, her voice trembling slightly. The carefully constructed facade of composure was cracking. How could this happen?" Anya met her gaze, her own eyes filled with a weariness that mirrored the exhaustion in Eleanor's posture. "It happened, Eleanor. It's the truth." She picked at a loose thread on her skirt, avoiding the intensity of Eleanor's stare. The worn fabric felt comforting against her fingertips, a small solace in the storm raging around her. "But, Richard," Eleanor whispered, her voice choked with emotion. The memory of Richard, of their shared life, their dreams, seemed to weigh heavily upon her. She ran a hand through her perfectly styled hair, the gesture betraying her inner turmoil. "He never mentioned a daughter." The unspoken question hung in the air. Anya felt a pang of sympathy for Eleanor. The betrayal wasn't just hers. It was Eleanor's too. Their shared grief, however different its source, created a strange, fragile bond between them. Anya knew she couldn't escape the weight of her decision, the impossible truth that had shattered their lives. The journal, Richard's journal, lay open on the table, its pages filled with a lifetime of secrets, of regrets. Anya's gaze drifted to the journal again, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. He wasn't ready to face it," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. The scent of lilies, remnants from Ethan's visit, still lingered faintly in the air, a poignant reminder of the love she was forced to relinquish. The pain was a constant ache, a dull throb in her chest that echoed the pain of Eleanor's unspoken grief. The truth, she knew, was a bitter pill for them both to swallow, but it had to be swallowed. The path ahead remained uncertain, riddled with doubt, yet Anya knew that one step at a time, they would find their way through it, together. The following morning, sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Anya's small room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. The air, usually crisp and clean, felt heavy with unspoken words. Anya sat on the edge of the bed, the worn fabric a comfort against her bare legs. The journal, Richard's journal, lay open on her lap, its pages filled with a messy script detailing a youthful indiscretion, a love affair, and a desperate act of abandonment. The words blurred through her unshed tears. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, heavier than any physical burden. A soft knock echoed through the quiet room. It was Ethan. He stood hesitantly in the doorway, his usual confident demeanor replaced by a hesitant vulnerability. The sunlight caught the worry lines etched around his eyes, making him look younger, more fragile than Anya remembered. He carried a steaming mug, the scent of chamomile tea filling the air, a small gesture of comfort. "Can I come in?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper, barely audible above the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. Anya nodded, her throat too tight to speak. Ethan entered, closing the door softly behind him. He placed the mug on the bedside table, the warmth of the ceramic a stark contrast to the chill in the room. I read it," he said, his gaze fixed on the open journal. He didn't need to specify which journal. They both knew. Anya looked up at him, the unshed tears finally spilling over. "I'm so sorry," she choked out, the words catching in her throat. "I didn't want this for you, for any of us." He walked towards her, slowly, cautiously, as if afraid to disturb the delicate balance of their fractured world. He sat beside her on the bed, the mattress creaking softly under their combined weight. He reached out, his hand gently covering hers. The warmth of his touch was a lifeline in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "It's not your fault," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. It's everyone's fault. My family's prejudice, my father's, his mistakes." He paused, gathering his thoughts. The silence stretched, punctuated only by the soft sobs escaping Anya's lips. The shared grief, the shared burden of a family secret, forged a strange, unexpected bond between them. A bond stronger, perhaps, than the romantic love they had once shared. The love, though altered, was still there, transformed, but not extinguished. It was a brotherly, familial love, a love rooted in shared trauma. The future, they both knew, was uncertain. But in that shared moment of grief, in the quiet comfort of their shared sorrow, they found a fragile hope, a tentative step towards healing and acceptance. Anya looked at Ethan's hand covering hers, the simple gesture a profound statement of love and support. In that moment, the shattering truth felt less like a betrayal and more like a painful, shared inheritance. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the polished oak floors of the Montgomery mansion. Dust motes danced in the golden light, a silent testament to the upheaval that had shaken the family to its core. Anya sat alone in the sunroom, the scent of lilies from the overflowing vase a stark contrast to the bitterness clinging to the air. She traced the delicate veins on a fallen petal, her thoughts a turbulent sea. Ethan's words from the previous night echoed in her mind. It's not your fault, but the guilt gnawed at her. This wasn't how she envisioned her life, her future with Ethan. A hesitant knock. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her usually impeccable composure fractured. Her eyes, usually cold and assessing, were now filled with a hesitant vulnerability. "Anya," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "Can we talk?" Anya nodded, her throat tight. Eleanor entered, the weight of her unspoken apologies heavy in the air. She sat opposite Anya, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I've been thinking about everything, about my prejudices, my blindness. She paused, a tear escaping and tracing a path down her cheek. I was wrong, so terribly wrong. About you, about everything. Anya met her gaze, a flicker of surprised hope warming her heart. I know, she replied softly, her voice choked with emotion. And I forgive you. The words were a release, a letting go of the burden she'd carried for so long. Eleanor's shoulders slumped in relief. There's still so much to fix, she said, her voice breaking slightly. But I'm ready to try, for all of us. She looked directly at Anya, sincerity shining in her eyes, a genuine plea in her gaze. I want to be your mother, truly. Anya's eyes welled up. This wasn't the reconciliation she had hoped for, nor the one she'd expected. But in Eleanor's trembling voice and tear-streaked face, Anya saw a glimmer of genuine remorse, a willingness to change. The path ahead remained fraught with difficulties, but in this small moment of acceptance, a fragile seed of hope began to take root. The weight of the past was still there, but the sun was beginning to pierce through the clouds. The crisp autumn air, scented with wood smoke and decaying leaves, chilled Anya to the bone. She stood by the library window, the stained glass depicting a family, ironically unified, a stark contrast to her own fractured reality. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, a physical burden. Leaving Ethan, even for a time, felt like severing a limb. A soft knock. Ethan entered, his face pale, eyes shadowed with worry. He carried a steaming mug, the aroma of chamomile a gentle counterpoint to the storm raging within him. I brought you tea, he stammered, his voice hoarse. Anya managed a weak smile. Thank you. She took the mug, the warmth a small comfort against the chill that seeped into her soul. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, punctuated only by the crackling fire in the hearth. Its warmth felt mockingly distant. I understand, Ethan finally said, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a pain that mirrored her own. I don't blame you. It's too much. He ran a hand through his hair, the gesture revealing the exhaustion etched onto his youthful features. Anya nodded, tears stinging her eyes. It's not just about us, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. It's about everything, about them. She gestured vaguely towards the rest of the house, her heart heavy with the burden of their family's dysfunction. He sat beside her, their shoulders touching. The shared grief, the unspoken understanding, was a fragile bridge between them. The warmth of the fire, the scent of the tea, the muted light from the stained glass window, these small comforts did little to alleviate the crushing weight of their impossible situation. Their love, so intense, so undeniable, now threatened to fracture the family further. The decision, however painful, felt necessary. A first step toward healing, toward building a future free from the shadow of their tangled past. But the future remained uncertain, a vast unknown landscape shrouded in mist. The journey ahead promised to be long and arduous. The library, usually a haven of quiet contemplation, felt suffocating. Dust motes danced in the late afternoon sunbeams slanting through the stained glass, illuminating the strained silence between Anya and Ethan. The air, thick with unspoken words and the scent of old leather and decaying paper, pressed down on them. Anya's fingers, tracing the delicate veins of a faded rose on the antique rug, trembled slightly. It's not just about us, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper, the words catching in her throat. The chamomile tea, once a comfort, now felt bitter on her tongue. She looked at Ethan, his face etched with a grief that mirrored her own. His usually bright eyes were dull with exhaustion, the shadows beneath them deepening with every passing moment. He nodded, the movement slow and heavy. I know, my parents, they need time, but losing you. His voice cracked, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the air. The fire in the hearth crackled, a counterpoint to the fragile melody of their unspoken sorrow. Anya reached out, her fingers brushing against his. His hand enveloped hers, a silent promise of enduring connection. The warmth of his touch, a small ember in the vast emptiness, offered a fragile sense of hope. Yet, the shadow of their impossible situation loomed large, a constant reminder of the choices they had to make. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful symphony reflecting the turmoil within the house. The Montgomerys' opulent home, once a symbol of security and privilege, now felt like a gilded cage. The weight of their family's secrets, their prejudices, their ingrained classism, pressed upon them, a suffocating burden. "We need to tell them," Anya said finally, breaking the silence. Her voice was firm, despite the tremor in her hands. The decision hung between them, heavy with consequence. Telling Richard and Eleanor the truth about her departure, about her need for space to process everything, was a necessary step, however painful. Ethan squeezed her hand. "Together," he murmured, his gaze unwavering. The unspoken understanding between them, a shared burden, a shared love, a shared hope for a future, strengthened the bond between them even as it tested it. The path ahead was uncertain, riddled with obstacles, but together, they would face it. The warmth of his touch, the shared silent promise, became the anchor amidst the storm. The journey had only just begun. The crisp autumn air bit at exposed skin as Anya walked the sprawling Montgomery estate grounds. Fallen leaves crunched under her boots, a melancholic counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of her heart. The grand house, usually a symbol of wealth and privilege, felt like a prison. She stopped by the old oak, its gnarled branches reaching towards the bruised twilight sky, mirroring the turmoil within her. The scent of damp earth and decaying leaves filled her nostrils, a poignant reminder of impermanence. She pulled out a worn photograph from her pocket, a faded image of a younger Richard Montgomery, his eyes full of a youthful recklessness that starkly contrasted with the guilt-ridden man she knew now. The memory of his whispered apologies, his raw confession of his past mistakes, brought a fresh wave of painful understanding. She hadn't realized the depth of his regret, the weight of his silence. A sob escaped her lips, a choked sound swallowed by the wind. She wasn't just grappling with her newfound sibling relationship with Ethan. She was grappling with the legacy of her father's choices, with the complex tapestry of secrets and lies that had woven itself into the very fabric of this family. She wiped her eyes, her gaze drifting towards the distant lights of the house, each window a silent witness to the family's unfolding drama. Suddenly, a hand rested on her shoulder. She turned to see Ethan, his face drawn and tired, his eyes mirroring her own sorrow. "Anya," he began, his voice hushed. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," she replied, her voice soft. "I understand." She met his gaze, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. The shared burden of their secret, the weight of their impossible love, was a bond that transcended blood. He pulled her into a hug, the warmth of his body a comfort against the chill of the evening. For a moment, the pain eased, replaced by a fragile sense of shared understanding. But the weight of their situation remained, a looming shadow threatening to engulf them once more. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the rustling leaves and the mournful sigh of the wind. The task ahead, to tell Richard and Eleanor everything, remained, a daunting and yet necessary step on their painful journey towards resolution. The future remained uncertain, but in this shared moment of quiet solace, a fragile hope flickered, a testament to the enduring power of love, even amidst impossible circumstances. The following morning, a thick fog clung to the Montgomery estate, mirroring the uncertainty swirling within the family. Eleanor, usually impeccably groomed, wore a rumpled silk robe, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. She sat at the kitchen table, a half-eaten croissant abandoned beside a lukewarm cup of tea, the delicate china a stark contrast to her inner turmoil. Richard entered, his face etched with lines of worry deeper than usual. He moved with a stiffness that spoke of unspoken guilt. "Eleanor," he began, his voice raspy, "we need to talk." She met his gaze, her expression unreadable. "About what, Richard?" "About the elephant in the room that's been crushing us since Since the test results. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. About Anya. About everything. He poured himself a stiff brandy, the amber liquid a splash of color in the somber morning light. The clinking of the glass amplified the silence that followed. The silence was broken by a soft knock. Ethan stood in the doorway, his face pale, his usually vibrant eyes dull with fatigue. He carried a steaming mug, the fragrant steam a small beacon of warmth in the chilly room. I overheard, Ethan began, his voice barely above a whisper. I know about your past, father. Richard looked at his son, his eyes filling with a mixture of pain and regret. I'm sorry, Ethan, for everything. Ethan swallowed, his throat tight. I need time, he said, his gaze dropping to the floor, the worn wooden planks a testament to the house's age and the weight of its secrets. He looked at Anya, then back at his father. The weight of the unspoken hung heavy in the air. The fog outside thickened, obscuring the already dim light, a poignant metaphor for the family's clouded future. The scent of burnt coffee suddenly filled the air, a jarring intrusion on the tense quiet, a small crack in the dam of their unspoken emotions, soon to burst forth in a torrent of confessions and tears. The afternoon sun, weak and watery, filtered through the stained glass windows, casting fractured rainbows across the polished oak floors. Dust motes danced in the golden light, a silent testament to the stillness that had settled over the Montgomery household. In the library, a room usually vibrant with conversation and the rustle of turning pages, only the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock broke the silence. Eleanor sat curled in a plush armchair, a worn copy of Jane Austen lying unopened in her lap. Her gaze was fixed on the crackling fire, its flames mirroring the turmoil within her. Richard entered, his footsteps hesitant on the thick carpet. He paused, watching her for a long moment, his face etched with lines of weariness. He poured himself a glass of amber liquid, the clinking of ice a sharp sound in the quiet room. Eleanor, he began, his voice a low murmur. I've been thinking. She didn't turn, her shoulders slumped in defeat. About what, Richard? About how we've destroyed everything. Her voice, usually crisp and controlled, was thick with unshed tears. He joined her by the fire, his presence a heavy weight in the room. About Anya, he confessed, his gaze meeting hers. About the past, about us. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, his gesture conveying the weight of his years, the burden of his secrets. A long silence stretched between them, filled only with the crackling fire and the rhythmic tick-tock of the clock. It was a silence heavy with unspoken accusations, with years of suppressed emotions finally threatening to erupt. The tension finally broke when Eleanor turned, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. It wasn't just class, Richard, she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. It was fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of losing you, of losing everything. Richard reached for her hand, his touch tentative, uncertain. The warmth of his hand in hers was a small spark of hope amidst the ashes of their shattered world. The weight of their shared guilt, their unspoken regrets, seemed to lessen, replaced by a tentative hope, however fragile. The fog that had settled over their lives seemed to lift just slightly, promising a long, slow journey towards healing. The journey was far from over, yet the air held a glimmer of warmth, a hint of forgiveness. The following weeks were a blur of hesitant conversations and awkward silences. The Montgomery mansion, once a symbol of effortless elegance, felt heavy with unspoken words and lingering resentments. Sunlight streamed through the bay windows of the breakfast room, illuminating the untouched pastries on the silver platter. Ethan, his usual boisterous energy muted, picked listlessly at his food. Anya, pale but resolute, sat opposite him, a faint smile playing on her lips as she watched him. It's different, Ethan mumbled, his gaze fixed on his plate. The unspoken different hung in the air, thick and heavy with the weight of their changed reality. Anya reached across the table, her hand covering his. The simple gesture, once a declaration of love, now held a quiet tenderness, the touch of a sister. "Yes, it is," she agreed softly, her voice a gentle balm to his turbulent emotions. "But it's also new." He looked up, meeting her gaze. Her eyes, usually sparkling with mischief and intelligence, held a depth of understanding that surprised him. He saw not only his former lover, but a woman who had endured far more than he could imagine. A woman who, despite everything, offered him compassion. A wave of guilt washed over him, a bitter taste mixing with the remnants of his breakfast. Later that day, in the hushed sanctuary of his childhood bedroom, Ethan stared out at the manicured lawns, the perfect symmetry a stark contrast to the chaos within him. He pulled out a worn photo album, the leather cover cracked and faded. He flipped through pages filled with sun-drenched memories. Family vacations, Christmas mornings, awkward teenage portraits. His gaze lingered on a picture of a younger Richard. His father's face, carefree and handsome, etched with an innocence he hadn't seen for years. He felt a profound sorrow, a kinship with the man in the photograph, a man burdened by secrets and haunted by regret. The weight of the past settled upon him, the realization that he and his father were more alike than he'd ever imagined. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the room, a silent testament to the passage of time, the passage of wounds, the slow, uncertain path towards reconciliation. The library, usually a sanctuary of quiet contemplation, hummed with a nervous energy. Sunlight slanted through the tall windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays. Richard sat heavily in a leather armchair, the worn leather cool beneath his fingertips. Eleanor paced, her usually elegant movements frantic, the click of her heels echoing in the vast space. The scent of old books and polished wood did little to soothe the tension that crackled between them. "It's not just about Anya," Eleanor finally said, her voice tight with unshed tears. The confession hung in the air, heavy and fragile. "It's about us, Richard. About everything we pretended not to see, everything we ignored." Richard looked up, his gaze meeting hers. His eyes, usually bright and sharp, were shadowed with weariness. "I know," he whispered, his voice raspy. He ran a hand through his thinning hair, the gesture betraying his inner turmoil. The weight of his past, of his deception, pressed down on him, a crushing burden. A long silence followed, broken only by the ticking of an antique grandfather clock in the corner. The rhythmic tick-tock seemed to mock their stillness, a relentless reminder of time's relentless march. Eleanor stopped pacing, her shoulders slumping. She sank onto a velvet chaise lounge, the plush fabric swallowing her small frame. "We built our lives on lies," she murmured, her voice barely audible above the ticking clock. The words hung in the air, heavy with regret. A life of privilege, built on a foundation of secrecy and denial. She closed her eyes, as if shielding herself from the pain. Richard rose, his movements slow and deliberate. He walked towards her, stopping just inches away. He didn't touch her, but the silence between them throbbed with unspoken words, years of unspoken words. He saw the fragility in her posture, the tremor in her hands, and a wave of profound guilt washed over him. This wasn't just about Anya. It was about the crumbling edifice of their marriage. "We can fix this," he said, his voice hoarse, a plea more than a statement. The words felt hollow even to him, but they were a beginning, a fragile, tentative beginning. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, highlighting the dust motes in their silent dance. The future remained uncertain, but in the quiet of the library, a glimmer of hope, fragile as a newborn's breath, flickered between them. The following weeks were a blur of hushed conversations and strained smiles. The Montgomery mansion, once a symbol of effortless elegance, felt suffocating, its polished surfaces reflecting the family's fractured state. Ethan, pale and drawn, spent hours in the sun-drenched conservatory, the scent of jasmine failing to soothe his conflicted heart. Anya, surprisingly composed, occupied herself with quiet tasks, her movements carrying a quiet strength that belied the turmoil within. The air thrummed with unspoken anxieties. One evening, After a particularly tense dinner where Eleanor's forced cheerfulness felt like a brittle facade, Ethan found Anya in the library, the only place where the family's silent war seemed to momentarily subside. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls lined with leather-bound books. "It's different now, isn't it?" Ethan began, his voice barely a whisper above the crackling fire. Anya looked up, her eyes mirroring the firelight's glow. "Different is an understatement," she replied softly, her voice husky with unshed tears. "I never imagined." She trailed off, unable to articulate the strangeness of their new reality. He sat beside her, the worn velvet of the chaise lounge surprisingly comforting. "I miss us," he admitted, the words catching in his throat. The weight of their secret, of their forbidden love, now tinged with the impossible truth of their blood relation, was almost unbearable. Anya reached out, her hand covering his. "I miss us too," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly. "But this is real too. We're family, Ethan, and that's something to hold on to." He nodded, the unspoken words hanging heavy between them. The comfortable silence that followed was a balm to their wounded hearts, a fragile bridge built across the chasm of their changed world. The scent of old paper and leather mingled with the sweetness of jasmine, creating a strange, poignant aroma that somehow reflected the bittersweet reality of their situation. They were siblings, yes, but their bond was undeniably profound, a complicated tapestry woven from love, loss, and the undeniable pull of family. The future remained uncertain, yet in the quiet glow of the library fire, a quiet hope flickered, a testament to the resilience of the human heart. The following weeks saw Richard and Eleanor retreat into separate corners of their vast home. The silence, once comfortable, now crackled with unspoken resentments. Eleanor, haunted by her prejudiced past, found solace in long walks through the meticulously manicured gardens, the scent of roses a bitter reminder of her own thorny nature. Richard, consumed by guilt, spent hours in his study, the leather-bound books offering little comfort. The heavy oak desk, usually a symbol of his power, now felt like a prison. One rainy afternoon, he found Eleanor in the conservatory, her shoulders slumped, the vibrant colors of the orchids doing little to brighten her mood. The air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. "Eleanor," he began, his voice hoarse. The words felt clumsy, inadequate. He reached out, his hand hovering over hers. She didn't flinch away, but neither did she meet his gaze. I didn't know," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the drumming rain. About Anya, the confession, long overdue, felt raw and vulnerable. He pulled her gently into his arms, the scent of her perfume, usually so comforting, now carrying the weight of their shared pain. "Neither did I," he admitted, the words a confession as much to himself as to her. "And I'm so sorry." The silence that followed was broken only by the rhythmic patter of rain against the glass roof. It wasn't a reconciliation, not yet, but it was a beginning, a crack in the wall of their carefully constructed lives, allowing a fragile light of honesty to seep through. The weight of their shared secret, once a suffocating burden, began to feel slightly lighter, shared now, not just endured. The rain continued, washing away not just the dirt, but some of their guilt, paving a path, however uncertain, towards forgiveness. The scent of rain and roses now held a subtle promise, a hint of renewal in the damp air. The sprawling Montgomery estate, usually a symbol of effortless wealth, felt claustrophobic. Sunlight, usually streaming through the expansive windows, was muted by the persistent drizzle, mirroring the gloom settling over the family. Richard, his shoulders slumped, sat alone in his study, the leather of his chair cool against his skin. The scent of old books and pipe tobacco, usually comforting, did little to soothe his frayed nerves. He reread the DNA report, the stark, clinical language a stark contrast to the emotional turmoil it had unleashed. He heard Eleanor's footsteps approaching, the soft tap-tap-tap of her heels on the polished wood floor. She paused at the doorway, her reflection shimmering in the dark mahogany. Her usually impeccable composure was shattered. Her eyes, usually bright with a controlled energy, held a raw vulnerability. "Richard," she began, her voice strained. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions. The air was heavy with the scent of her perfume, jasmine, sharp and sweet, a fragrance that had always signified strength, now tinged with sadness. He rose, extending a hand towards her. "Eleanor," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He didn't need words. Her pain mirrored his own. The shared weight of their secret pressed down on them, a suffocating blanket of guilt and regret. It's Anya," she finally said, her voice cracking. She stepped into the room, the movement slow, deliberate. The quiet rustle of her silk blouse was the only sound besides the relentless drumming of rain against the window panes. How could we have been so blind? He pulled her into his arms, the familiar comfort of her presence a fragile anchor in the storm of their emotions. He buried his face in her hair, breathing in the familiar scent of jasmine, finding a strange solace in the shared sorrow. "I failed her," he murmured, the words a confession wrung from his soul. "I failed us all." The rain outside intensified, its rhythmic drumming a counterpoint to the silent sobs escaping Eleanor's chest. The scent of rain and roses, once a symbol of their privileged life, now mingled with the sharp tang of regret, a bitter reminder of their past mistakes. The weight of their shared past, however, felt slightly less crushing now that it was finally shared. No longer a hidden burden, but a sorrow they could bear together. The beginning of forgiveness, however fragile, shimmered between them like a nascent dawn. The following days were a blur of hushed conversations and strained smiles. The Montgomery mansion, once vibrant with laughter, now echoed with the unspoken. Richard, haunted by his past, spent hours in his study, the leather of his chair worn smooth by years of restless pacing. Eleanor, usually a picture of elegant composure, moved with a fragility that mirrored the cracks in their once immaculate facade. Their attempts at normalcy felt brittle, like fine china on the verge of shattering. One evening, Anya sat by the fireplace, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on her face. Ethan entered, his usual confident swagger replaced by a hesitant gentleness. He carried a steaming mug of chamomile tea, the aroma a gentle counterpoint to the tense silence hanging in the air. I wanted to see if you were all right," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the swirling steam. Anya looked up, a faint smile touching her lips. "I'm okay, Ethan. Just adjusting." He sat beside her, the silence comfortable now, laced with shared understanding. The weight of their secret, once a crushing burden, now felt strangely lighter, shared between them. He reached for her hand, his touch tentative, respectful. "I'm sorry," he said softly, his voice husky with emotion. "For everything. For my family's reaction. For my own blindness." Anya squeezed his hand, her eyes reflecting the firelight. "I know," she whispered. "But we're navigating this together, aren't we?" He nodded, relief washing over him. The fear, the uncertainty, the anger, all the emotions that had consumed him were slowly replaced by a quiet determination. He looked at Anya, his half-sister, his former lover, his future co-parent, and a wave of profound love, both familial and romantic, washed over him. The future was uncertain, complicated, but for the first time in weeks, he felt a flicker of hope, a fragile promise of healing. The rain outside had stopped, leaving behind a clean, crisp air, a fresh start. The following weeks were a delicate dance of cautious steps and hesitant forgiveness. Richard, his usually impeccable silver hair slightly unkempt, spent more time with Anya, a tentative affection replacing his initial disdain. The scent of old leather and pipe tobacco, once associated only with his study, now mingled with the subtle fragrance of Anya's lavender perfume. A subtle shift in the household's atmosphere. Eleanor, her usually rigid posture softened, began to initiate conversations with Anya, her voice betraying a newfound vulnerability. The clinking of china during dinner, once sharp and brittle, now held a gentler resonance, although silences still stretched, pregnant with unspoken emotions. One afternoon, sunlight streamed through the conservatory's arched windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Anya sat on a wicker chair, her hands cradling her burgeoning belly. Eleanor approached, a hesitant smile playing on her lips. "The baby, is it a boy or a girl?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, the question, both tentative and deeply personal. Anya smiled, a warmth spreading through her face. "It's a girl," she replied, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears. "We're going to name her Hope." Eleanor's eyes filled. "Hope?" she repeated, the name hanging in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. A shared silence followed, broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves outside. It was a silence filled not with tension, but with a quiet understanding, a shared acknowledgement of the journey they had both undertaken. The weight of their prejudices, once so immense, began to feel lighter, as if a hidden burden had finally been lifted. The conservatory, once a symbol of their privileged world, now felt like a sanctuary, a space where healing could begin. The scent of blooming jasmine and the soft sunlight worked together to form a quiet peace. A fragile peace, yes, but a peace nonetheless. The past remained, its shadow still lingering, but the future, illuminated by the promise of hope, shone brighter. The Montgomery mansion, usually a bastion of stiff formality, hummed with a low thrum of nervous energy. Sunlight, slanting through the tall windows of the breakfast room, gilded the polished mahogany table where Anya sat, a fragile smile playing on her lips. The scent of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the faint, sweet aroma of her lavender perfume. Richard, his usually severe features softened, poured her a cup, his hand trembling slightly. The clinking of the china sounded unusually loud in the sudden quiet. "How are you feeling, darling?" he asked, his voice rougher than usual. Anya met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a quiet strength. "Tired but good. The baby's kicking more now." She touched her swollen belly, a tender gesture that spoke volumes. Eleanor, observing them from across the table, swallowed hard. The image of her initial outrage, the harsh words flung at Anya, felt like a distant, painful memory. The weeks that followed had been a gradual thawing, a slow drip of understanding melting the icy barriers of her prejudice. She found herself drawn to Anya's quiet dignity, her resilience in the face of their hostility. Ethan, pale and thinner than he had been, entered the room. The haunted look in his eyes reflected the inner turmoil he still grappled with. The love for Anya was undeniable, a powerful force that overshadowed the complexities of their new sibling relationship. He moved to Anya's side, his hand resting gently on her shoulder, a silent gesture of support and affection. "Morning?" Ethan murmured, his voice husky. "Morning, son," Richard replied, his gaze shifting between his son and Anya. A palpable tension hung in the air, the unspoken words of their shared secret still heavy upon them. The weight of their past mistakes was evident, yet a nascent hope, like a fragile seedling pushing through hardened earth, began to take root. The family's healing process was fragile, yet undeniably present. The sound of the ticking grandfather clock in the hall, usually irritating, now felt like a steady heartbeat, marking the passage of time and the slow but certain progress towards forgiveness. The sun continued its slow descent, casting long shadows across the room, a silent witness to the family's evolving dynamic. The air, once thick with resentment, now held the faint promise of peace. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the sprawling Montgomery estate. Inside, the air in Anya's room hummed with a quiet anticipation. She traced the delicate curve of her burgeoning belly, a faint smile playing on her lips. The doctor's reassurance echoed in her mind. The baby was healthy, thriving, but the weight of the family's secret, the knowledge of her relationship with Ethan, still pressed heavily on her. A soft knock sounded. "Come in," she called, her voice barely a whisper. Ethan entered, his gaze hesitant, his usual confident air replaced by a quiet vulnerability. He carried a small, velvet box. I wanted to give you this," he stammered, extending the box. Anya opened it, revealing a delicate silver locket. Inside, a tiny photograph. A younger Ethan and Anya, laughing on a summer day, their youthful joy stark against the backdrop of their current reality. Tears welled in Anya's eyes. "It's beautiful, Ethan," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." He sat beside her, taking her hand. "I know things are complicated, but I want you to know, more than ever, that I love you, as my sister and, well, as someone I've always loved." His hand tightened around hers. The unspoken hung heavy between them. A shared history, a love redefined, a future uncertain but filled with a fragile hope. The locket, a tangible reminder of a past they couldn't change, symbolized their evolving present. A sibling bond forged in the crucible of a secret that had shaken their family to its core. The sun dipped lower, casting the room in a warm golden glow, a quiet testament to the unspoken promise of a future filled with both challenges and a love that defied definition. The scent of lavender and chamomile hung heavy in the air, a calming balm against the storm raging within Anya. She sat by the window, the late afternoon sun painting the sprawling estate in hues of gold and amber, a stark contrast to the darkness swirling inside her. The doctor's words, "perfectly healthy," repeated in her mind, a fragile anchor in the turbulent sea of her emotions. Her hand instinctively went to her belly, a gentle caress that felt both protective and vulnerable. A soft knock. "Come in," she called, her voice barely a tremor. Eleanor entered, her face etched with a weariness Anya had rarely seen before. The steely resolve Eleanor usually wore had softened, replaced by a hesitant vulnerability. "How are you, dear?" Eleanor asked, her voice softer than Anya remembered. Anya managed a small smile. "I'm well. Tired, mostly." The lie felt comfortable, a shield against the weight of her confession. Eleanor sat beside her, her gaze lingering on Anya's swollen belly. "Richard, he's been different." The statement hung in the air, pregnant with unspoken anxieties. "He's trying." Anya nodded, understanding the effort it took for Richard, a man built on control, to unravel. She saw it in his hesitant smiles, the clumsy attempts at affection, the quiet moments when his eyes reflected years of buried guilt. The man who had initially demanded a DNA test now held her hand, murmuring apologies. "He's starting to understand," Anya said, her voice catching slightly. "It's a process." Eleanor reached out, taking Anya's hand. "We all are," she admitted, her eyes filled with unshed tears. "Your father, he's a good man, Anya. He's just always been so afraid to show it." The silence that followed was filled with the unspoken weight of their shared history, of prejudice overcome, of a family slowly rebuilding itself from the rubble of its own making. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows, painting the room in warm, forgiving hues. Anya felt a single tear trace a path down her cheek, a tear not of sadness, but of understanding, of healing, of a family finally, tentatively, coming together. The nursery, painted a soft, sun-drenched yellow, hummed with quiet activity. Anya, her face glowing with a gentle maternal light, hummed a lullaby as she arranged tiny, hand-knitted booties. The scent of baby powder mingled with the faint sweetness of her lavender-scented lotion. Ethan entered, a hesitant smile playing on his lips. He carried a small, intricately carved wooden rocking horse, a gift from his grandfather, a gesture of reconciliation that still felt fragile. "He seems peaceful," Ethan murmured, his gaze fixed on Anya's serene profile. Anya smiled, a touch of wistfulness in her eyes. "He's already kicking," she whispered, her hand gently resting on her rounded belly. "He feels so real now." Palpable shift had occurred. The initial animosity, the raw accusations, the bitter recriminations, they felt like a distant nightmare. The family's prejudiced walls were slowly crumbling, replaced by tentative bridges of understanding. Eleanor, though still reserved, now offered Anya a genuine smile, her eyes holding a depth of empathy that Anya had never seen before. Richard, once stiff and distant, now frequently sought out Anya, his apologies unspoken but palpable in his gentle touch, the careful way he carried her shopping bags. Ethan sat beside Anya, his fingers tracing the delicate embroidery on the booties. The past few months hadn't been easy. The revelation of their half-sibling relationship had shattered their world. Yet ironically, it had forged a bond stronger than mere romantic love. They were learning to navigate this new territory, the awkwardness punctuated by moments of shared laughter, of unspoken understanding. "I still can't believe it," Ethan whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's surreal." Anya nodded, her eyes reflecting the same bewilderment. "Surreal and yet right," she replied. Their bond, forged in love and tested by adversity, was now solidifying into something new, something deeper. The enduring love of siblings bound by an unimaginable truth. The rocking horse, a symbol of a family slowly reuniting, seemed to gently sway in time with their shared, quiet joy. The future remained uncertain, yet for the first time, a sense of hope, fragile yet undeniable, filled the sun-drenched nursery. The crisp autumn air swirled fallen leaves outside the nursery window, mirroring the turmoil still swirling within the Montgomery family. Sunlight streamed through the lace curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden light. Anya, her pregnancy now visibly advanced, sat cradling a soft, crocheted blanket, her fingers tracing its intricate pattern. A quiet anxiety thrummed beneath her calm exterior. Ethan entered, his usual confident swagger replaced by a hesitant gait. He carried a stack of baby books, their brightly colored covers a stark contrast to the weight of their unspoken anxieties. "I found some books on, well, you know," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. His cheeks flushed, a mixture of embarrassment and nervousness coloring his skin. Anya offered a small, understanding smile. "Thank you, Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely a whisper. The air between them, once charged with passionate longing, now held a different, quieter intimacy. The tender bond of siblings learning to navigate uncharted territory. The unspoken acknowledgement of their shared past hung heavy, a silent guest in the sunlit room. He sat beside her, the books forgotten in his lap. The silence stretched, filled only with the rhythmic thump of Anya's heart and the distant hum of the central heating. The weight of their secret, of their shared blood, still pressed upon them, a constant reminder of the tumultuous journey they'd undertaken. Ethan reached out, his hand hesitantly covering hers. His touch was gentle, respectful, a stark contrast to the clumsy affection of their past. "I'm glad," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "that we're doing this together." Anya squeezed his hand, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The fear, the uncertainty, the raw pain of the past months, all of it coalesced into a single, powerful emotion. Gratitude. Gratitude for the unexpected bond that had blossomed from the ashes of their shattered dreams. A bond stronger, perhaps, than the romantic love they had lost. "Me too," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. The future, once a blurry landscape of uncertainty, now held a glimmer of hope, a quiet promise of a family forged not in conventional expectations, but in the crucible of shared pain and unexpected discovery. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the room, a silent testament to the passage of time, the slow, painstaking work of healing. Their journey was far from over, but in the shared silence, in the gentle touch of their hands, a new beginning whispered its promise. The scent of lilies, Anya's favorite, hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the lingering tension. Richard, his face etched with a weariness that went beyond the usual stresses of his life, sat across from Eleanor. The crackling fireplace cast flickering shadows on their faces, highlighting the deep lines of worry etched around Eleanor's eyes. Silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Finally, Richard cleared his throat, the sound brittle and strained. "We need to talk about everything." Eleanor's gaze, usually sharp and intelligent, was clouded with a mixture of pain and uncertainty. She reached for her teacup, her hand trembling slightly. "About Anya?" she whispered, the single word heavy with unspoken accusations and regret. Richard nodded, his gaze dropping to his hands. About Anya, about Ethan, about us. About everything we've done and everything we've left undone. He paused, searching for the right words, the right tone. The DNA test. It changed everything. It revealed a truth we both tried to ignore for so long. Eleanor's breath hitched. The memory of her initial reaction to Anya's pregnancy, the prejudice that had almost consumed her, returned with brutal clarity. The guilt was a palpable thing, suffocating her. I was wrong, she managed, her voice barely audible. Terribly, horribly wrong. A tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek, leaving a glistening trail in its wake. Richard reached across the chasm that had opened between them, his fingers brushing against hers. The contact was a fragile bridge, spanning years of unspoken resentments and misunderstandings. We both were, he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. But we have a chance to make things right. We have to. He looked at her, really looked at her, seeing the pain and regret reflected in her eyes. The love he felt for her, the love that had survived years of hardship and miscommunication, was stronger than ever before. This time it would be different. This time he would make it right. The weight of his past mistakes, however, remained a burden. The path ahead, though filled with hope, was still daunting. The morning sun, a pale gold, filtered through the gauzy curtains, illuminating dust motes dancing in the stillness of Anya's room. She sat on the window seat, cradling a mug of chamomile tea, its warmth a poor substitute for the turmoil within. The DNA test results had irrevocably altered everything. She was Richard Montgomery's daughter, Ethan's half-sister. The weight of the revelation pressed down on her, a suffocating blanket of disbelief and sadness. A soft knock on the door preceded Ethan's hesitant entry. He carried a plate laden with pastries, a small attempt at comfort. His eyes, usually sparkling with mischief, were shadowed with worry. "Morning," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. He placed the plate on the bedside table, the delicate clinking of china a jarring sound in the quiet room. Anya offered a small, strained smile. "Morning," she replied, her voice husky. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken emotions, a silent acknowledgement of the chasm that separated them, yet the undeniable bond that still tethered them together. I wanted to apologize," Ethan began, his gaze fixed on the pastries. "For everything. For my family's reaction." Anya's gaze softened. "They're scared," she said quietly, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Scared of the unknown, of losing their carefully constructed world." She took a sip of her tea, the warm liquid doing little to soothe the bitter taste in her mouth. "I understand." Ethan nodded, his shoulders slumping slightly. "But that doesn't make it right. I could have done more." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and love. The love, she knew, was complicated now, tainted with the knowledge of their shared blood. It was a love that would never be. "We'll figure it out," Anya said, her voice stronger now, a newfound resolve hardening her features. The fear, though still present, was slowly being replaced by a determined acceptance of their complicated reality. Together, as siblings. He reached across the space between them, his hand gently covering hers. The touch was comforting, reassuring, a fragile bridge spanning the turbulent waters of their shared past. The gesture wasn't romantic, but it was profoundly meaningful. It was a promise whispered in the quiet intimacy of the shared space. A promise of a future built not on forbidden love, but on the foundation of a newfound familial bond. The sun continued its slow ascent, casting long shadows across the room, a silent witness to the beginning of their journey toward healing. The therapist's office smelled faintly of lavender and old books. Richard sat stiffly, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, the expensive fabric of his trousers feeling strangely constricting. Eleanor sat beside him, her usual composed demeanor fractured, replaced by a quiet anxiety that vibrated in the air between them. Dr. Albright's gentle voice cut through the silence. "The discovery of Anya. It's shaken your foundations," hasn't it? Richard cleared his throat, the sound raspy. More than shaken. It's overturned everything. He looked at Eleanor, his gaze heavy with unspoken regret. I never wanted to hurt you, Ellie. Eleanor's eyes glistened. It's not just about the hurt, Richard. It's about the lies, the omissions. 25 years. 25 years of a secret that could have destroyed us. She took a deep breath, composing herself. The prejudice, I'm ashamed of it. But how do we undo that? How do we build something solid again after this? We start with honesty, Richard said, his voice low. We talk about the past, the pain, the fear. He glanced at a framed photo on Dr. Albright's desk. A smiling family, vibrant and whole. A stark contrast to the fractured image they presented now. I have to face what I did. Later, at home, the quiet was a fragile truce. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the living room. Ethan entered, holding a small, hand-painted ceramic bird. He approached Anya, who sat on the sofa, a book lying open in her lap, her pregnancy subtly altering her silhouette. I found this in the attic, he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. It was your mother's. Anya's hand trembled as she took the bird, its delicate weight a poignant reminder of a past she never knew. Her eyes welled up, but this time, the tears felt different, laced with a bittersweet blend of grief and acceptance. Thank you, she whispered, her voice cracking slightly. The unspoken understanding between them, the quiet acknowledgement of shared loss and budding reconciliation, hung heavy in the air. A fragile bridge over a chasm of hurt and misunderstanding, slowly being rebuilt, brick by painful brick. The silence held the weight of their shared past, yet whispered a promise of a future they were cautiously starting to build, together. The sterile scent of antiseptic mingled with the sweet floral aroma of lilies in the birthing room. Eleanor's hand, gnarled with age but surprisingly strong, clasped Anya's. The rhythmic rise and fall of Anya's chest, a counterpoint to the beeping monitors, filled the hushed room. Richard hovered near the window, his gaze lost in the cityscape below, a stark contrast to the life blooming within the room. Ethan paced, his usually controlled demeanor unraveling, a whirlwind of anxious energy. A cry, sharp and piercing, cut through the tension. A tiny, wrinkled face emerged, eyes blinking open to a world brimming with both joy and apprehension. A wave of relief washed over the room, palpable and profound. It's a girl, the nurse announced, her voice soft, tinged with awe. Eleanor's tears flowed freely, a torrent of years of regret and prejudice finally breaking through. She squeezed Anya's hand, a silent apology and a heartfelt acceptance. Richard, his face etched with emotion, approached cautiously, his eyes reflecting a mixture of love and astonishment. He gently touched the baby's tiny hand, his own trembling slightly. Ethan knelt beside Anya, his heart swelling with a love he hadn't anticipated. He looked at the newborn, a perfect blend of Anya's dark eyes and his own fair hair. This child was a testament to their love, a symbol of their journey, a new beginning. The quiet moments following the birth were filled with a hushed reverence, a profound understanding that transcended words. The family, once fractured and divided, was slowly mending, their shared experience forging a stronger, more resilient bond. The baby's gentle sighs, the soft rustle of sheets, the hushed whispers, all contributed to a sense of peace, a fragile yet potent harmony. The weight of their past remained, but it was now overshadowed by the radiant joy of their shared future. A future painted in the soft hues of forgiveness and love, a future born of a past irrevocably changed. The days melted into weeks, each sunrise painting the nursery in a gentler light. The baby, named Hope, thrived, her tiny gurgles a constant soundtrack to the Montgomery household's newfound harmony. Eleanor, her face softened by a constant smile, spent hours cradling Hope, her touch gentle, her gaze filled with a love that belied her past prejudices. She's perfect, Richard, she whispered one afternoon, her voice catching slightly. Richard, watching them, a quiet contentment settling over him, simply nodded, his eyes shimmering with unshed tears. The change in Richard was profound. The rigid lines around his mouth softened, replaced by a warmth that reached his eyes. He actively engaged with Anya, his conversations less strained, filled with a genuine curiosity about her life, her dreams. He finally admitted, "I failed you, Anya. I'm sorry." Anya, her own eyes shining with unshed tears, simply embraced him, the years of resentment melting away in the warmth of his apology. Ethan, still grappling with the complexities of his feelings for Anya, now channeled his love into a protective devotion for his niece. He spent hours playing with Hope, his gentle touch surprisingly adept. He and Anya shared stolen glances, a silent acknowledgement of their unique bond. A bond forged in love, tested by circumstance, and ultimately strengthened by forgiveness. Their love story had taken an unexpected turn, but it was a turn that led them to a deeper, more profound understanding of themselves and each other. Their love, while romantic, transformed, becoming a familial affection as strong as the love they felt for their daughter. One evening, gathered around the fireplace, the crackling flames mirroring the warmth in their hearts, they shared stories, tales of their lives before, their fears, and their hopes for the future. The air hummed with a quiet energy, a testament to their shared journey, a testament to the power of forgiveness and the unbreakable bonds of family. The past still held a place in their hearts, but it no longer cast a shadow. It was a part of their story, a reminder of the strength they found within themselves and each other. Hope, nestled in Anya's arms, slept peacefully, a tiny symbol of their new beginning, a beacon of hope illuminating their future. The nursery, bathed in the soft glow of dawn, hummed with a quiet energy. Hope, nestled in Anya's arms, stirred, her tiny fingers clutching a strand of Anya's hair. The scent of baby powder and Anya's lavender perfume hung in the air, a comforting aroma that permeated the room. Richard stood by the window, the rising sun painting his face in a warm, ethereal light, a stark contrast to the grim shadows that had haunted him for so long. He watched Anya, a mixture of love and regret swirling within him. "She's beautiful," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Anya looked up, a gentle smile gracing her lips. "She's perfect," she agreed, her eyes sparkling with unshed tears. The unspoken words hung between them, a testament to their shared journey, a silent acknowledgement of their past pain and their present joy. Eleanor entered, her face radiating a happiness that seemed both fragile and fiercely protective. She held out a soft, knitted blanket, her touch hesitant, yet filled with an affection that spoke volumes. "I made this for her," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. The gesture was small, yet it held the weight of 1,000 apologies, 1,000 unspoken regrets. It was a symbol of her transformation, a testament to her ability to overcome her prejudices and embrace her new family. The air crackled with unspoken emotions, a poignant silence that held more meaning than any words could express. Ethan joined them, his expression a mixture of awe and a quiet, enduring love. He gently stroked Hope's cheek, his touch hesitant yet filled with an overwhelming tenderness. The past was still present, a ghost that haunted them all, but its grip was loosening, replaced by the burgeoning hope of a new dawn. The family stood together, their shared journey weaving an invisible thread of connection that could never be broken. The love that bound them, though tested and tried, had emerged stronger and more profound than they could have ever imagined. The nursery, a haven of soft pastel hues and the faint scent of baby powder, buzzed with a quiet joy. Hope, swaddled in a hand-knitted blanket, slept soundly, her tiny breaths a rhythm of life against the stillness. Sunlight streamed through the window, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the golden rays. Anya, her face etched with a tender weariness, sat in a rocking chair, humming a soft lullaby. The exhaustion was palpable, yet her eyes shone with an almost unbearable love. "She has your eyes?" Richard murmured, his voice hoarse with emotion, breaking the quiet. He stood near the crib, his gaze fixed on the sleeping infant. His usual crispness was gone, replaced by a vulnerability that was both startling and endearing. Anya smiled, a bittersweet expression that spoke volumes. "And your chin?" she replied softly, her voice thick with sleepiness. "A perfect blend." The unspoken words between them were heavy with the weight of their shared history, a past marred by prejudice and misunderstanding, now slowly giving way to acceptance. Eleanor entered, her steps lighter than they'd been in months. The stiffness in her posture was gone, replaced by a hesitant grace. She carried a small, intricately carved wooden toy, a gift she'd painstakingly chosen for her granddaughter. I thought she might like this," she stammered, her eyes welling up. The apology hung unspoken, yet it resonated more powerfully than any verbal confession could have. Ethan knelt beside Anya, his hand gently resting on Hope's tiny hand. The past few weeks had been a whirlwind of emotions, yet a quiet peace settled over them now, a testament to their resilience and their newfound understanding. He leaned over, kissing Anya's forehead, a tender gesture filled with unspoken gratitude and enduring love. The silence that followed was not empty, but rather filled with the unspoken language of forgiveness, of healing, of a family finally finding its way back to each other. The weight of their shared past remained, but it was no longer a crushing burden. Instead, it served as a foundation upon which they were building a future bright with hope, love, and the promise of a new beginning. Hope slept on, oblivious to the turmoil that had preceded her birth, a symbol of their new dawn. The Montgomery mansion, usually a stage for hushed elegance, hummed with a different kind of energy. Sunlight streamed through the leaded windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the golden rays, a stark contrast to the storm that had raged within these walls. Hope, now a chubby 6-month-old, gurgled happily in her playpen, a tiny, oblivious heart beating in the center of the whirlwind. Anya, cradling a steaming mug of chamomile tea, watched her daughter with a quiet smile. The exhaustion etched on her face spoke of sleepless nights and endless feedings, but her eyes held a deep, unwavering contentment. The initial shock of the DNA results, the family's prejudices, the turmoil of their newfound sibling bond, all seemed distant now, softened by the passage of time and the unifying force of motherhood. "She's getting so big," Eleanor murmured, entering the room, her voice a soft counterpoint to Hope's gurgles. The stiffness that had once clung to her like a second skin had melted away, replaced by a hesitant warmth. She knelt beside Anya, her hand gently brushing Hope's cheek. "I made her a new rattle," she added, a genuine smile softening her features. The apology remained unspoken, yet it resonated in the shared glances, the unspoken gratitude. Ethan, entering the room, leaned against the doorframe, a silent observer. The initial guilt and confusion of their past relationship had given way to a complex, brotherly affection. He watched Anya and his mother interact, a warmth blooming in his chest. This wasn't the fractured family they once were. This was something new, something stronger. Richard joined them, his usual crisp demeanor replaced by a quiet attentiveness. He picked up Hope, cradling her close, his touch tentative but full of love. "Look at her," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. The years of regret and shame, the weight of his past mistakes, had begun to lift, replaced by a profound sense of redemption. He looked at Anya, his eyes mirroring the unspoken understanding that bound them. The air thrummed with the unspoken language of forgiveness, a quiet symphony of healing. The past still cast its shadow, but it no longer defined them. They had faced their demons, their prejudices, their past mistakes, and emerged stronger, more unified, a testament to the enduring power of love and family. The future stretched before them, uncertain yet bright with hope, a promise of a new dawn where love had triumphed over adversity. The scent of lavender and baby powder hung heavy in the air, a comforting blanket against the lingering chill of the autumn evening. Hope, now a vibrant, giggling 6-month-old, was sprawled on a plush rug, batting at a brightly colored toy. Anya watched her, a soft smile playing on her lips, the lines of exhaustion around her eyes softening as she gazed at her daughter. The weight of the past year, the revelation, the turmoil, the eventual reconciliation, seemed to lift with each gurgle and playful kick. "She's learning to crawl," Ethan announced, his voice hushed with awe. He knelt beside her, his fingers gently tracing the curve of her tiny hand. The initial awkwardness between them, the lingering ghost of their forbidden love, was almost entirely gone, replaced by a deep, abiding affection. Brotherly love, perhaps, but with an undercurrent of something more profound, a shared history etched into their souls. Eleanor, perched on a nearby armchair, watched them with a wistful smile. The rigid formality that had once defined her had dissolved, replaced by a gentle grace. "Richard's teaching her to say Grandpa," she said, her voice laced with a tenderness Anya had never witnessed before. The unspoken apologies, the slow, agonizing process of dismantling their ingrained prejudices, had finally borne fruit. Richard entered the room, his shoulders less stiff, his expression warmer than Anya had ever seen. He carried a small, intricately carved wooden horse, its painted mane gleaming. He knelt beside Hope, his touch gentle, his eyes filled with a love that spoke volumes. The years of regret, the pain of his youthful indiscretion, were still present, but they no longer consumed him. He'd found a measure of peace, a hard-won serenity that radiated from him. "She's a Montgomery," he said, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze meeting Anya's. The statement was simple, yet it held a profound significance. It wasn't just an acknowledgement of blood ties. It was a declaration of belonging, a testament to their shared journey. The unspoken words hung in the air: forgiveness, acceptance, love, a silent symphony of healing. The past, though indelible, no longer held them captive. They were a family, imperfect, flawed, yet undeniably bound together by the unbreakable threads of love and shared experience. The future, though uncertain, held the promise of a new dawn. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the plush rugs. 6 months had passed since Hope's birth, 6 months since the Montgomery family had begun their tentative steps towards wholeness. Anya, cradling Hope, watched Ethan across the room, a quiet contentment settling over her. The initial awkwardness between them had melted, replaced by a comfortable familiarity, a shared understanding that transcended the complexities of their past. "She started babbling," Ethan murmured, his eyes alight with a tenderness that softened his sharp features. He reached out, his fingers brushing against Hope's cheek. The gesture was simple, yet it held a wealth of unspoken emotions: forgiveness, acceptance, a deep-seated bond forged in the crucible of their shared ordeal. Eleanor, observing them from her armchair, smiled. The icy reserve that had once encased her had thawed, replaced by a warmth that radiated outwards, a tangible testament to her own journey of self-discovery. "She looks just like you," she said to Anya, her voice laced with genuine affection. The words held a profound significance, a confirmation of Anya's place within their family, a recognition of her inherent worth beyond her past role as a nanny. Richard, entering the room, settled into a nearby chair. His shoulders, once perpetually hunched with the weight of his secrets, were relaxed, his expression open and serene. He watched his family, a quiet pride evident in his gaze. The years of regret that had burdened him were still present, but they no longer held him captive. They were a part of his past, a shared history that had ultimately strengthened the bonds between him and his family. The air hummed with a quiet joy, a comfortable silence broken only by the soft sounds of Hope's gurgles. Clarity, a shared understanding that transcended the complexities of their past. His eyes alight with a tenderness that softened his words, a tangible testament to her own journey. "She looks just like you," she said to Anya, faced with genuine affection. The words held a profound significance. Place within their family, a recognition of her inherent worth beyond Nanny. Richard, entering the room, settled into a nearby chair. The weight of his secrets, his expression open and serene. A quiet pride evident in his gaze. The years of regret that had burdened him were still present, but they no longer held him captive. They were a part of his past. His family. The air hummed with a quiet joy, silence broken only by the soft sounds of Hope's girl.